true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. In rural Georgia, James had taken a shortcut to avoid the usual traffic, only to find himself on a seemingly endless highway. The road stretched out before him, eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. It was a clear night, but there was something off about the way the road signs seemed to shift and blur. Creeping unease settled over him as he noticed that familiar landmarks kept changing position. At first, James thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The road signs appeared to dance in and out of view, creating a disorienting effect. Every time he passed a sign, he'd expect the next one to be in the same spot, but instead, they seemed to have moved. The disorienting feeling was unsettling, making him feel like he was trapped in a nightmarish loop. The tranquil night was giving way to an ever-growing sense of dread. The farther James drove, the more he realized that the highway was a trap. A sinister game orchestrated by an unknown force. He tried to retrace his steps, but the road signs kept shifting, ensuring he couldn't find his way back. Faint sounds of laughter seemed to echo around him, making the whole experience even more chilling. He was no longer just lost. He was entangled in a malevolent presence's cruel scheme. As the hours ticked by, James felt the oppressive weight of the highway closing in on him. The surroundings grew increasingly menacing, with the shadows of the trees looking like dark, creeping figures. The once familiar highway had transformed into a haunting maze, with every turn leading him further into its eerie grasp. He could feel the malevolent presence drawing closer, beating off his fear. In a desperate bid to escape, James slammed on the brakes and got out of his car, hoping to find some sort of landmark or sign of civilization. But the night seemed to mock him with its silence and the disorienting darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting strange, unsettling shadows on the trees. The feeling of being hunted was relentless, like an invisible predator lurking just out of sight. The further James wandered, the more he realized he was walking in circles. The road, which once seemed straightforward, now appeared to twist and loop in impossible ways. Each sign he encountered seemed to whisper to him, urging him deeper into the highway's clutches. The fear was palpable, an almost physical presence pressing down on him. Eventually, exhausted and disoriented, James returned to his car, hoping that he might find a way out if he drove long enough. But as he started the engine, the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, with the same haunting signs and shifting landmark. The realization dawned on him with chilling clarity. There was no escape from this forsaken highway. James's attempts to leave grew more desperate. As the night wore on, the highway seemed to laugh at his futile efforts, its malevolent presence weaving through the darkness. A haunting sense of being watched was almost unbearable, making every sound and shadow seem sinister. The road had him trapped, and the longer he stayed, the more it seemed to consume him. As dawn approached, James felt a glimmer of hope, thinking the light might break the highway's grip on him. But even as the first rays of sunlight touched the road, the signs remained eerily unchanged, and the oppressive atmosphere didn't lift. He was still ensnared in the highway's curse, the haunting loop that refused to release him from its grasp. By the time the sun was fully up, James was left with the unsettling realization that the forsaken highway had become his new reality. The road had claimed him, and there was no telling how many others had fallen victim to its eerie, malevolent design. The once familiar route had turned into a never-ending nightmare, and James was now part of its chilling story. In the dense Pisgah National Forest near Asheville, North Carolina, Emma and her friends were excited to camp under the stars. The forest, with its towering trees and thick underbrush, seemed like the perfect escape from city life. However, the The evening took a chilling turn when they discovered eerie messages carved into the trees warning them to leave. The warnings were cryptic. The feeling of foreboding was unmistakable. At first, Emma and her friends laughed off the carvings as a prank or the work of a deranged individual. They continued setting up their campsite, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over them. The forest had a haunting quality to it, with the shadows of the trees creating a labyrinth of dark shapes. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry ghostly voices, adding to the sense of unease. As night fell, the forest grew even more ominous. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Emma noticed that the messages on the trees seemed to shift and change as the firelight flickered. The shifting messages created a sense of being watched, as if some unseen entity was observing their every move. The forest's dark, oppressive silence was punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig. Despite their attempts to stay calm, the fear was palpable among the group. Emma's friends were increasingly on edge, each noise in the darkness sending them into a state of anxious alertness. The eerie feeling grew stronger, and the forest seemed to come alive with an unsettling presence. The oppressive atmosphere made it clear that something malevolent was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. Determined to prove that the warnings were nothing more than a prank, Emma decided to investigate further into the forest. As she ventured deeper, the forest became eerily silent. The usual nighttime sounds replaced by an unsettling quiet. The trees, now twisted and gnarled, seemed to close in around her. Every shadow felt menacing, and the cold wind carried whispers that seemed to taunt her. The deeper Emma went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees appeared to shift and change positions, creating a disorienting maze. She began to feel as though the forest itself was alive, guiding her deeper into its clutches. The sense of being hunted by an ancient spirit grew stronger, the oppressive weight of its presence almost tangible. Emma's heart pounded as she realized she was hopelessly lost. Desperate to escape, Emma turned back, only to find that the path she had taken had vanished. The forest had transformed into a nightmarish maze, the trees now seeming to conspire against her. The once familiar forest had become a haunted, twisting labyrinth, and the feeling of being pursued by an ancient, malevolent spirit was overwhelming. Emma could almost feel the entity's cold breath on her neck as she stumbled through the darkness. As the hours dragged on, Emma's fear reached a fever pitch. The forest, now a living nightmare, seemed to close in on her, the oppressive silence broken only by her ragged breaths. The sense of dread was suffocating, and the once beautiful forest had become a chilling prison. The spirit, with its ancient rage and malevolence, seemed to be closing in on her, ensuring that escape was nearly impossible. Finally, Emma's friends found her, barely conscious and on the brink of hysteria. The forest, as if satisfied with its prey, seemed to release its grip, allowing them to escape. But the haunting experience left them forever scarred, with the chilling memories of the Pisgah National Forest lingering in their minds like an unwelcome shadow. On the outskirts of Chicago, Illinois, Lisa was driving home from a late-night shift when she encountered a toll booth that hadn't been there before. It stood alone in the dark, illuminated by the harsh glow of a single flickering light. Curiosity and fatigue got the better of her, and she stopped to pay the toll, despite the ominous feeling that settled over her. Little did she know, this toll booth was a gateway to a nightmarish journey. After paying, Lisa resumed her drive, only to find the road ahead warped into an endless loop. No matter which direction she turned, she always ended up back at the toll booth. The unsettling realization that she was trapped in this macabre loop filled her with a sense of dread. The toll booth, now a haunting fixture, seemed to mock her efforts to escape with its eerie, unchanging presence. As the minutes turned to hours, the nightmarish quality of the road began to intensify. The familiar landscape of Chicago's outskirts became a surreal and menacing tableau. The once familiar roads twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes, the shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes. Each turn she took only seemed to lead her deeper into a chilling trap. the toll booth reappearing with disturbing regularity. Lisa's panic mounted as the same scenery repeated over and over again, each loop growing more nightmarish than the last. The toll booth's flickering light cast long, sinister shadows that seemed to reach out and grasp at her as she drove past. The oppressive feeling of being trapped was compounded by the relentless, haunting presence of the toll booth, making her feel as though she was being watched by something malevolent. Desperate to break the cycle, Lisa tried to drive off the road, only to find her car unable to leave the asphalt. It was as if an invisible barrier prevented her from escaping the twisted loop. The toll booth, now a symbol of her entrapment, loomed larger in her mind, a haunting reminder of her inability to escape the nightmare. The chilling realization that she was being toyed with by an unseen force was almost too much to bear. The darkness of the night seemed to close in around her, the road becoming a distorted maze of fear and confusion. Lisa's attempts to navigate the shifting landscape only seemed to draw her further into the loop's sinister grasp. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, with the toll booth's flickering light becoming a haunting beacon of her trapped fate. The sense of dread and hopelessness grew stronger, suffocating her with its oppressive weight. In the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, Mark decided to take a shortcut through a dark, wooded area to avoid the usual traffic. The shortcut, though unmarked on the map, seemed like a quick way home. As he ventured into the woods, the air grew colder, and the dense trees formed an almost suffocating canopy above. The silence of the forest was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the eerie calls of distant animals. The deeper Mark drove, the darker and more oppressive the woods became. Trees, now thick and twisted, seemed to press in on him from all sides. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and a chill ran down his spine. The shortcut, which he had hoped would save him time, was turning into a haunting ordeal. The sense of dread was palpable, as if the forest itself was conspiring against him. Suddenly, Mark's headlights illuminated an unsettling sight: an abandoned shack deep within the woods. The shack, old and decrepit, looked as though it had been untouched for decades. The sight was eerie, and he felt an inexplicable urge to turn back. But curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate the dilapidated structure, hoping to find some clue about this foreboding shortcut. As Mark approached the shack, he noticed strange symbols scrawled on the walls. The symbols were crude, and their meanings were unclear, but they exuded a chilling sense of malevolence. The shack's interior was filled with a musty, oppressive air, and Mark felt an unsettling presence. The realization dawned on him that he might have stumbled into a trap set by a sinister force that preys on lost travelers. The atmosphere grew more menacing as Mark explored further. The forest seemed to close in around him, with shadows moving in the periphery of his vision. Every creak and groan of the shack seemed to echo with an otherworldly resonance. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, as if something unseen was stalking him through the darkness. Mark's heart pounded as he tried to find his way back to the car. Desperate to escape, Mark fled from the shack and returned to his vehicle, but the woods had become a twisted maze. The once familiar shortcut had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth with no clear path out. The trees seemed to shift and move, and the darkness was absolute. Every turn led him deeper into the forest's clutches, the malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Mark's attempts to navigate the forest only seemed to lead him further into its deadly embrace. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the haunting sound of footsteps or distant whispers. Forest, which had seemed like a simple shortcut, was now a terrifying trap, with every road and path leading him deeper into the unknown. The chilling realization that escape was impossible left him in a state of sheer panic. While camping in the Redwood National and State Parks in California, a group of friends, Sarah, Mike, and Jenny, stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The campsite, hidden deep within the towering redwoods, seemed oddly preserved. with remnants of old campfire ashes and worn-out camping gear scattered around. The sight was both intriguing and unsettling, and their curiosity got the better of them. They decided to set up their camp nearby, despite the strange and eerie vibe of the site. As night fell, the forest around them seemed to come alive with an unnatural stillness. The towering trees cast long, haunting shadows that danced in the flickering light of their campfire. The friends began to notice strange symbols etched into the trees surrounding the campsite, symbols that were unfamiliar and unsettling. A sense of foreboding settled over them, and the comforting sounds of the forest seemed to fade into an eerie silence. Jenny, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, started to investigate the symbols further. Each symbol seemed to carry a chilling aura, as if they were warning of something sinister. Her flashlight revealed more symbols, each more disturbing than the last. The deeper they delved into the mystery, the more the sense of being watched grew. It was as though the forest itself was aware of their presence and disapproved of their intrusion. As the night wore on, strange occurrences began to unfold. The campfire light seemed to waver and shift, casting unsettling shadows that moved independently of the fire. Friends heard whispers carried on the wind, whispers that seemed to be a blend of fear and anger. The forest, once welcoming, now felt like a trap, with the ancient trees looming ominously over them. The sense of being hunted by something malevolent grew stronger with every passing moment. The forest grew increasingly dark and oppressive, and the friends felt an almost tangible presence among the trees. They decided to leave the campsite. The path they once knew seemed to twist and change, leading them in circles. The sense of being trapped in a nightmarish maze intensified as the forest seemed to close in on them. The feeling of being pursued by an unseen force was overwhelming, and the eerie silence of the woods was deafening. In a desperate bid to escape, Sarah, Mike, and Jenny tried to find their way back to their vehicle, but the forest had become a twisted labyrinth. The once familiar terrain was now an ominous and shifting maze, with the symbols and shadows adding to their disorientation. Each step felt like it was taking them deeper into a dark and malevolent realm, and the oppressive sense of danger was nearly unbearable. Their attempts to navigate the forest only seemed to draw them further into its clutches. The ancient redwoods, now shrouded in darkness, seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches creating a suffocating canopy. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the sound of their panicked breaths. The forest seemed to pulse with a chilling energy, as if it were alive and determined to keep them from escaping. On a desolate stretch of road in rural Maine, Tom drove through the dense woods, the headlights slicing through the encroaching darkness. It was an unusually quiet night, and the solitude of the forest felt both peaceful and unsettling. Suddenly, he began to hear faint whispers coming from the woods. At first, they were barely audible, like a distant conversation. They grew louder and more frantic as he drove. The whispers seemed to beckon him, leading him deeper into the forest's heart. Tom's curiosity got the better of him, and he slowed down, straining to hear the whispers more clearly. They were now a haunting cacophony, swirling around him with a chilling urgency. The eerie voices seemed to guide him, and as he followed the sound, the forest grew denser and more foreboding. The shadows between the trees lengthened, and a sense of dread began to settle in, as if the whispers were leading him toward a hidden terror that emerged only under the cover of night. Despite the growing unease, Tom pressed on, driven by a morbid curiosity. The whispers led him to a small clearing, where the darkness seemed to take on a tangible form. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated structure, half hidden by the overgrown vegetation. The place had an unsettling aura, as if it had been abandoned for years, yet somehow it was still waiting for him. The whispers grew louder, their frantic tones now almost pleading. As he approached the structure, Tom noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, their meanings obscured by time and decay. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the distant, haunting whispers that seemed to echo from every corner of the clearing. The sense of being watched intensified, and Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The whispers now seemed to come from the shadows themselves, guiding him toward a terrifying revelation. Tom entered the structure, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The inside was filled with strange, ancient artifacts and remnants of rituals long forgotten. The whispers grew louder, their frantic tone now accompanied by a chilling, supernatural presence. It was as if the very walls of the place were alive, resonating with the voices of those who had come before him, trapped in a nightmarish loop. The deeper Tom ventured, the more the whispers seemed to envelop him, their urgency increasing as if trying to warn him of something unspeakable. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him began to shift and writhe, as though they were alive. Tom's heart raced with terror as he realized that the whispers were not merely guiding him, but were part of a malevolent force that sought to keep him trapped in this place forever. Desperately, Tom turned to leave, but the clearing had changed. The familiar path he had taken was now obscured by a dense fog that seemed to rise from the ground. The whispers were now a cacophony of desperate, pleading voices, urging him to stay. As he struggled to find his way out, he felt a cold, ghostly touch on his shoulder, and a sense of overwhelming dread filled him. The road he had once found quiet and peaceful was now a labyrinth of terror, with no escape in sight. Traveling along Route 66 in Arizona, Laura decided to take a break at an old rest stop she had spotted from the highway. The place looked abandoned, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds, but it seemed like a good spot to stretch her legs and grab a quick snack. As she stepped inside, she noticed how the interior seemed frozen in time. The faded posters on the walls and the dusty vending machines gave the place an eerie, almost haunting quality. Laura's initial curiosity turned to unease. As she explored the rest stop, she found strange items scattered around. An old newspaper with headlines about disappearances and a notebook filled with cryptic notes. The more she explored, the more she felt an unsettling presence, as if she were being watched. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. A chilling realization began to dawn on her. She might not be alone. In the dim light of the rest stop, Laura noticed strange markings on the walls, resembling symbols she couldn't quite understand. They seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy, casting long, ghostly shadows in the flickering light. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, and the oppressive atmosphere of the place seemed to weigh down on her. It became clear that this was not just an abandoned rest stop, but something far more sinister. As Laura continued to investigate, she stumbled upon a hidden door leading to a basement. The stairs creaked ominously as she descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was filled with old, dusty furniture and personal belongings that looked like they had been left in a hurry. The chilling feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming, and she felt an increasing sense of dread as she searched the basement for answers. In a dark corner of the basement, Laura discovered a collection of old photographs and documents detailing the rest stop's grim history. It became apparent that the place had a deadly reputation, associated with a series of unexplained disappearances. The air was thick with an unsettling presence, and Laura felt a sudden, cold draft as if the ghosts of the past were trying to communicate with her. The sense of danger escalated as Laura realized she was not just in a place of history, but in a trap set by something malevolent. The rest stop, with its haunting past and eerie atmosphere, seemed to be alive, a sinister force. Desperate to leave, Laura raced back up the stairs, only to find the main entrance blocked by an invisible barrier. She was trapped, with the oppressive weight of the rest stop's dark history closing in on her. On the outskirts of Seattle, Washington, Mark found himself lost while driving through the fog-covered countryside. As he navigated the winding roads, he stumbled upon a small village that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The village was quaint and picturesque, with charming houses and a serene atmosphere. However, something about it felt unsettling and almost surreal, as if it existed on the edge of reality. Mark decided to explore the village, hoping to find directions or some form of assistance. The streets were eerily quiet, and the houses appeared empty, their windows dark and lifeless. As he walked through the village, he noticed that the landscape seemed to shift subtly, with familiar landmarks changing positions. The village, while hauntingly beautiful, had an air of deception, as if it was hiding something sinister. The longer Mark stayed, the more he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The village seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight, with an eerie, unearthly glow illuminating the streets. As he wandered further, he began to realize that the village was not just disappearing, but was part of a malevolent trap. The villagers, though unseen, seemed to be orchestrating a sinister game with him as their prey. Fog thickened, and the village's once charming facades began to crack and warp, revealing a more grotesque and unsettling reality. The houses, now twisted and distorted, seemed to close in on him. Mark felt an invisible force guiding him through a nightmarish maze of streets that led nowhere. The village, which had once seemed like a safe haven, was now a chilling trap designed to ensnare him. As Mark desperately tried to find a way out, the village's true nature became horrifyingly clear. The once serene setting was a facade for a nightmarish reality, where the boundaries of time and space were blurred. The villagers, now revealed as spectral entities, were intent on keeping him trapped in their twisted realm forever. The sense of being hunted and the haunting atmosphere of the village left Mark in a state of sheer terror. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Mark ran through the village, his heart pounding with fear. The streets seemed to shift and change around him, making it impossible to find his way back to the entrance. The village, with its chilling, malevolent presence, had become a labyrinth of horror, where every turn led him deeper into its ghostly embrace. While navigating through the murky swamps of Louisiana, Clara's headlights caught sight of an abandoned car in the middle of a narrow, fog-choked road. The vehicle was eerily pristine, as if it had been left there just moments ago. Yet the surrounding swamp seemed to have swallowed everything else. Clara's curiosity, mixed with a sense of unease, prompted her to stop and investigate. The chilling fog rolled around her, and the silence was broken only by the occasional croak of a distant frog. Stepping out of her car, Clara felt the oppressive humidity close in around her. The abandoned car looked out of place, its shine contrasting starkly with the dilapidated swamp. As she approached, she noticed the interior was untouched, and the engine was cool, as if the car had been abandoned for longer than it seemed. The swamp's silence was unnerving, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by unseen eyes. The ground around the car was soft and treacherous, and Clara's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the thick quiet. The sense of being followed grew stronger, and she started to hear faint rustling sounds in the underbrush, like someone, or something, moving just beyond her sight. The feeling of dread was almost palpable, as if the fog itself was concealing a lurking predator. Clara's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the unsettling atmosphere. As she circled the car, the rustling sounds grew louder and more deliberate. Clara's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Fog thickened, swallowing up the light and further distorting her surroundings. She realized that the swamp seemed to be closing in on her, the once distant rustling sounds now echoing with a haunting intensity. The sensation of being stalked was overwhelming. Clara decided to return to her car and leave the area, but as she turned, she saw that the vehicle she had driven was no longer where she had parked it. The horror of the situation hit her like a cold wave. Her car had vanished without a trace. The once familiar road was now obscured by the thickening fog, and the sense of being trapped in the swamp became more pronounced. The rustling sounds had stopped, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. In a desperate attempt to find her car and escape, Clara pushed through the dense undergrowth, her flashlight struggling to penetrate the heavy fog. The swamp seemed to shift around her, a path she thought she knew now, leading her deeper into a nightmarish maze. The feeling of being hunted by an unseen predator was unrelenting, and the fog itself seemed to thicken with an almost malevolent intent. Every step she took felt heavier, the swamp's oppressive grip dragging her deeper into its chilling embrace. Clara's fear mounted as she realized that her attempts to find her car were only leading her further into the swamp's clutches. The sensation of being watched was all-consuming, and she could no longer distinguish between the sounds of her own breathing and the rustling that seemed to follow her every move. Clara's flashlight began to flicker and die, leaving her in near total darkness. The haunting silence was occasionally broken by distant, eerie calls from the swamp, as if the very land was taunting her. The sense of doom was palpable, and Clara's panic escalated. The once silent swamp now felt alive, a terrifying entity determined to keep her from escaping its grasp. In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, Dave found himself driving through an area where the sky seemed perpetually stuck in twilight. The sun had set hours ago, yet a peculiar, eerie light bathed the landscape in an unchanging, dusky hue. Dave's curiosity was piqued by the unsettling sight, and he decided to press on, despite a growing sense of unease. The perpetual twilight created a haunting atmosphere that made the familiar terrain feel foreign and unsettling. The road stretched ahead, shrouded in the same dim light that made it impossible to discern whether it was dawn or dusk. Dave noticed that the landscape around him seemed strangely static, as though time itself had come to a standstill. The trees, bathed in the twilight glow, cast long, haunting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The sensation of being trapped in a liminal space was overwhelming, and the feeling of dread began to seep in. As Dave continued driving, he saw occasional, faded road signs seem to flicker and shift in the twilight. The usual landmarks he relied on for navigation were nowhere to be seen, replaced by a disorienting, unchanging scenery. Every turn seemed to lead him back to the same eerie landscape, twilight creating an inescapable loop. The sense of being ensnared in a nightmarish realm of eternal dusk grew stronger with each passing mile. His attempts to find a way out only deepened his sense of dread. The perpetual twilight had an almost hypnotic effect, making it difficult for Dave to gauge the passage of time or distance. The road ahead seemed to stretch on indefinitely, and the lack of any definitive markers made it feel like he was wandering in a ghostly purgatory. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on him, and he could feel an unseen force watching his every move. Desperate for answers, Dave pulled over to the side of the road and tried to get a glimpse of the sky. The twilight seemed to have a sinister quality, its light casting eerie reflections on the trees and the road. As he stepped out of his car, cool air felt unnaturally still, and the haunting silence of the landscape was deafening. He realized that the twilight was not just a peculiar phenomenon, but a curse trapping travelers in an unending night. The sense of being ensnared in a cursed realm was almost unbearable. Dave felt a cold shiver as the twilight seemed to close in around him, the light growing dimmer and more oppressive. The endless twilight was a manifestation of a dark force that preyed on those who wandered into its grasp. Each attempt to escape only seemed to tighten the grip of the curse, and the perpetual dusk began to feel like a prison, from which there was no escape. Dave's growing desperation turned to horror as the realization set in. He was trapped in a realm of eternal night. Time had no meaning, and the boundaries of reality were blurred. The chilling truth was that the twilight was not just an eerie spectacle, but a powerful curse, forever binding him to its haunting embrace. The sense of entrapment was overwhelming, and as the twilight deepened, Dave knew that escape might be nothing more than a cruel illusion. In the backwoods of Pennsylvania, Sarah was driving home after a long day when she noticed strange lights flickering in the distance. The lights appeared intermittently through the dense trees, casting eerie, wavering glows that seemed to beckon her. Intrigued and somewhat unnerved, Sarah decided to follow the lights, hoping to uncover their source. The woods, cloaked in an unsettling darkness, seemed to pulse with a chilling energy as she drove deeper into the forest. The deeper Sarah went, the more the lights seemed to flicker and dance in the periphery of her vision. They moved with an almost sentient quality, as if they were deliberately guiding her towards some hidden destination. The haunting glow of the lights created a mesmerizing yet disorienting effect, making it difficult for her to gauge the distance or direction. The sense of being lured into something sinister grew stronger, and the woods around her took on a more ominous, foreboding quality. As she ventured further, Sarah found herself in a secluded clearing bathed in the flickering light of the mysterious orbs. The lights danced in midair, casting strange, distorted shadows on the trees and the ground. The clearing felt strangely surreal, as if it existed outside of normal time and space. The mesmerizing lights seemed to draw her in, and a deep sense of foreboding washed over her, as she realized she was walking into a carefully laid trap. Flickering lights intensified, and Sarah began to feel an unsettling presence around her. The shadows grew darker and more animated, and the forest seemed to close in, pressing against the edges of the clearing. The lights now seemed almost malevolent, their once charming flicker turning into an ominous signal of danger. The eerie silence of the clearing was occasionally broken by unsettling sounds, like whispers or distant cries, that made the atmosphere even more chilling. As Sarah tried to backtrack, he found that the woods had become a labyrinth, shifting shadows and false paths. The lights, now seemingly mocking her attempts to escape, continued their haunting dance, leading her deeper into the trap. The realization that the lights were not a beacon of hope, but a lure designed to ensnare her, became painfully clear. The once familiar backwoods had transformed into a nightmarish maze, with no apparent way out. In a frantic bid to escape, Sarah pushed through the disorienting darkness, her flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The forest around her seemed to mock her efforts, with the flickering lights now appearing to swirl around her in a disorienting pattern. The sense of being trapped and hunted by something that thrived on fear was overwhelming, and the once charming lights now seemed like a cruel taunt from the darkness. Camping near the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, Alex and his friends were looking forward to a night under the stars, away from the noise of the city. They set up their campsite in a quiet clearing surrounded by dense woods. As the night settled in, they noticed a faint, flickering light in the distance, a campfire that seemed to be burning without anyone around. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate, despite a creeping sense of unease. As they approached the source of the light, the sight of the campfire was both strange and haunting. Fire crackled and danced, its warmth radiating into the cool night air, but there were no people in sight. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, and the woods seemed to close in around them, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The fire's light cast long, distorted shadows that made the trees appear like gnarled, looming figures. Alex and his friends gathered around the campfire, trying to make sense of the situation. They noticed that the campsite was oddly well preserved, with old, weathered camping gear scattered around as if left behind in a hurry. The sense of something being amiss grew stronger as they realized that the campsite was completely devoid of any recent human activity. The fire, while still burning, seemed to hold a ghostly, otherworldly quality. The fire's flickering light began to cast strange shapes on the ground, and the friends started to hear faint, eerie whispers carried by the wind. The whispers seemed to come from the surrounding woods, adding to the sense of dread. The once comforting warmth of the fire turned into an unsettling presence, and the friends felt an oppressive weight in the air, as if the campfire was a beacon drawing them into a sinister event from the past. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The whispers grew louder and more frantic, and the shadows around the campfire seemed to twist and writhe with an unsettling life of their own. Alex felt a chilling sensation that something tragic had happened here long ago, and the campfire was a spectral remnant of that event. The realization that they might be intruding on something deeply haunting made the situation even more terrifying. In a desperate attempt to leave, Alex and his friends tried to pack up and head back to their own campsite. However, forest paths seemed to have changed. The once familiar trail now led them in circles. The campfire's eerie glow continued to illuminate their surroundings, casting a haunting light on the twisting, shifting shadows of the woods. The feeling of being trapped in a supernatural event was overwhelming, and the forest seemed to conspire against their escape. On a foggy evening near Seattle, Washington, Jake was driving through a remote stretch of road when he stumbled upon a quaint, seemingly idyllic village. The village appeared out of nowhere, its old-fashioned charm and cozy houses bathed in the soft, eerie light of the streetlight. Intrigued, Jake decided to explore, thinking it might be a hidden gem in the vast, misty wilderness. However, as he drove deeper into the village, a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. The village had a surreal quality, its neatly arranged houses and neatly paved streets, all looking as if frozen in time. Yet, there was something unsettling about its perfection. The streets were eerily empty, and there were no signs of life, no sounds of conversation or laughter, just an oppressive silence. Jake felt as if he was being watched by unseen eyes, and the fog that blanketed the village seemed to add an extra layer of chilling mystery. Jake decided to park his car and wander around, hoping to find someone who could explain the village's strange appearance. As he walked, he noticed that the houses, while charming, had an unsettling stillness about them. The windows were dark, and the doors were closed tight, as if the entire village was holding its breath. The fog swirled around him, giving the impression that the village was not quite real, but rather a ghostly mirage conjured by the fog. As Jake explored further, he realized that the village seemed to shift and change. The houses and streets appeared to move subtly, their positions altering when he wasn't looking directly at them. The sensation of disorientation grew stronger, and Jake began to feel as though he was trapped in a nightmarish illusion. The village, which initially seemed like a charming discovery, was revealing itself to be a treacherous trap designed to ensnare unsuspecting travelers. Fog thickened, and the village began to dissolve into the mist. The once innocuous charm of the place turned into a chilling reminder of its true nature. The streets that had seemed so welcoming were now empty and unwelcoming, and the houses appeared to blur and fade. Jake's attempts to find a way out only led him deeper into the shifting maze of the village, and the growing realization that the village was a malevolent trap became undeniable. In a frantic bid to escape, Jake ran back to his car, but as he reached the spot where he had parked, he found that his car had vanished. The village was now completely engulfed in fog, and the once familiar surroundings had become an eerie, shifting labyrinth. The feeling of being hunted by an unseen force intensified, and Jake understood that the village was a malevolent trap for those who wandered too close. The village had claimed him just as it had countless others before him. As David drove through a remote tunnel in New York's Adirondack Mountains, the feeling of isolation was almost palpable. The walls of the tunnel, carved out of the ancient rock, loomed on either side, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere. His headlights cast eerie shadows, and the only sound was the steady hum of his engine. It wasn't long before David began to hear faint echoes of his own voice bouncing off the walls. The repetition was disconcerting, making the tunnel feel unnervingly alive. The echoes soon morphed into disturbing, dissonant noises that didn't quite match the rhythm of his voice. Strange, almost unintelligible whispers seemed to weave in and out of the echoes, growing louder with each passing moment. David's sense of unease deepened, and he felt as if he were not alone in the tunnel. The haunting sounds created a chilling ambiance, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of his headlights. As the echoes grew more pronounced, David noticed that the shadows in the tunnel seemed to move independently of his car. The dark shapes appeared to slither and twist along the walls, taking on an almost sentient quality. The once familiar tunnel now felt like a trap, a sinister realm where the laws of reality were bending to some unseen force. David's heart raced as he realized that the tunnel was harboring a deadly secret, one that was determined to keep him from escaping. The unsettling whispers became more frantic, and David's fear intensified as the tunnel seemed to close in around him. The walls, once solid and reassuring, now seemed to pulse with a haunting energy. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing behind him, growing closer with each passing second. The echoes were no longer just a distortion of sound, but a chilling reminder that something malevolent was following him through the tunnel. Desperate to escape, David accelerated, hoping to outrun the eerie presence that seemed to be closing in. The tunnel, however, appeared to stretch on endlessly, its dark, oppressive walls never giving way to the outside world. The whispers grew louder and more chaotic, merging into a cacophony of frightening sounds. David's sense of time and space began to warp, and the tunnel felt like a nightmarish maze designed to trap him forever. In a final, frantic bid for freedom, David turned off his headlights, plunging the tunnel into complete darkness. The sudden change in visibility made the whispers and echoes even more disorienting, and he could feel the oppressive weight of the unseen force pressing in on him. The tunnel's chilling embrace seemed to tighten, and David realized that escaping the tunnel's haunting grip would require more than just physical speed. It would demand a confrontation with the dark, sinister presence that lurked within. In a growing panic, Jenna tried to leave. The front door of the motel refused to budge, as if some invisible force was keeping her trapped inside. The haunting whispers she had heard earlier seemed to grow louder, echoing with a sinister urgency. The once familiar motel had transformed into a nightmarish maze, corridors that twisted and turned in disorienting ways. Jenna's heart pounded as she realized that the motel's true nature was far darker than she had initially imagined. Desperate and frightened, Jenna searched for an alternative exit, but every attempt only led her deeper into the motel's sinister labyrinth. The feeling of being pursued by unseen entities grew stronger, and the chilling realization dawned that the motel's abandonment was not merely a result of neglect, the consequence of something far more malevolent. The ghosts of those who had stayed there were now fully awakened, seeking to ensnare anyone who dared to intrude on their forgotten domain. In the vast, desolate stretches of the desert near El Paso, Texas, Jenna's car sputtered to a stop just outside a crumbling, abandoned motel. The once vibrant sign now hung askew, its neon lights long extinguished. It was the only building in sight, and with night rapidly approaching, Jenna decided it was the perfect place to spend the night. The motel's dilapidated appearance offset by the eerie, ghostly quiet of the desert, which made the decision to stay both convenient and unsettling. Stepping into the motel's lobby, Jenna was struck by a chilling silence that seemed to permeate the air. The interior was covered in layers of dust, with old furniture shrouded in white sheets. The faint smell of decay lingered, and the flickering light from a broken chandelier cast eerie shadows on the walls. As Jenna wandered through the empty rooms, she discovered a series of unsettling clues, faded photographs, old receipts, and personal items that suggested the motel had been abruptly abandoned, leaving behind more than just empty spaces. The deeper Jenna explored, the more she felt a creeping sense of dread. In one of the rooms, she found a bed with neatly folded sheets and a diary lying open on the nightstand. The diary's pages were filled with frantic, desperate entries about the occupants' last days in the motel, hinting at something sinister that had driven them away. The more she read, the more the atmosphere seemed to thicken with an oppressive, chilling presence. As night fell, temperature dropped, and the motel seemed to come alive with haunting echoes of the past. Jenna heard the faint sounds of footsteps in the hallways, followed by doors creaking open and shut as if unseen guests were moving about. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and every shadow seemed to flicker with a ghostly presence. The motel, once an ordinary establishment, now felt like a place trapped between worlds. a realm haunted by those who had never checked out. Nestled near the vast expanse of the Everglades in Florida, Tim and his friends decided to set up camp at an old, seemingly forgotten campground. The site was overgrown with thick foliage and the remnants of old campfires, giving it a quaint but unsettling charm. As they unpacked their gear and set up their tents, a chilling wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it an eerie, almost palpable sense of foreboding. The sense of isolation in the dense woods was profound, and the campground's eerie quietness was occasionally broken by unsettling, distant sounds. As night fell, Tim ventured to explore the abandoned campground further, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He stumbled upon various unsettling clues: rusted, old camping equipment, tattered signs warning of danger, and eerie symbols carved into the tree trunks. Each discovery added to the growing sense of dread that hung over the campsite. The symbols seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy, hinting at a past filled with mystery and malevolence. The darkness deepened, and the once innocuous campground took on a more sinister tone. Strange, ghostly figures seemed to flit in and out of the periphery of Tim's vision, and whispers echoed through the trees, growing louder and more frantic as he ventured further into the woods. The once cozy campsite now felt like a stage for something haunting and otherworldly, as if the very ground was alive with the restless spirits of those who had come before. Tim's friends, feeling the growing tension, gathered around the campfire, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. However, the campfire's light flickered ominously, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The once welcoming glow of the fire now took on a haunting quality, and the shadows it cast appeared to dance in a macabre performance. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The ghostly figures and whispers grew more insistent as the night progressed, converging around the campsite. The shadows took on a more solid form, their movements growing more aggressive and desperate. Tim and his friends felt an overwhelming sense of dread, realizing that the campground was not just abandoned but haunted by vengeful spirits. Chilling realization that they were intruding on a place filled with restless, malevolent entities made their situation even more terrifying. In a frantic attempt to escape, Tim and his friends packed up their gear and tried to leave the campsite, but the path back to their car seemed to shift and distort, leading them deeper into the woods. Campground, with its eerie symbols and restless spirits, had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. The once familiar surroundings were now a haunting maze, trapping them in a realm of supernatural terror. On a desolate highway in rural Wyoming, Robert was driving through the darkness, only sound being the steady hum of his car engine. The road seemed endless, bordered by vast stretches of empty plains that were swallowed by the night. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a narrow strip of the road ahead. The solitude of the drive was both peaceful and unsettling, and Robert found himself increasingly aware of the oppressive silence surrounding him. Suddenly, Robert noticed something strange. Shadows began to flit alongside his car, moving in and out of the beam of his headlight. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. The shadows grew more distinct and more aggressive. They seemed to stretch and contract, darting closer to his vehicle with an unnerving persistence. The haunting presence of the shadows made the once familiar drive feel like a twisted game of cat and mouse. The shadows began to take on a more defined form, their shapes growing darker and more menacing. They pressed closer to the sides of the car, moving in sync with its speed. The once innocuous drive turned into a nightmarish ordeal as Robert realized that these shadows were not mere tricks of the light but something far more sinister. The sensation of being hunted became overwhelming as the shadows seemed to encroach upon the car, their movements synchronized with Robert's increasing anxiety. Robert tried to accelerate, hoping to escape the encroaching darkness, but the shadows matched his speed, their presence growing ever more intense. The road seemed to narrow, the shadows closing in from all directions. Feeling of being trapped in a tightening vice became almost unbearable. The once safe highway was now a battleground between Robert and the malevolent darkness that sought to consume him. Desperate to escape, Robert swerved the car, hoping to dislodge the shadows from their relentless pursuit. However, the darkness seemed to adapt, its movements becoming more aggressive and disorienting. The road ahead was obscured by the encroaching shadows, and Robert found himself navigating a perilous path where every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the clutches of the darkness. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Robert slammed on the brakes, causing the car to screech to a halt. The shadows, momentarily thrown off by the sudden stop, surged around the vehicle in a chaotic frenzy. The once clear road was now a shifting maze of darkness, and Robert's heart pounded with the realization that the shadows were not just pursuing him, they were consuming the very road he sought to escape. In the remote forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Laura was driving home late one night, her headlights slicing through the dense darkness of the woods. The road wound through the forest like a dark ribbon, and the oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant hoots of owls or the rustling of leaves. Laura was enjoying the peaceful solitude when a ghostly figure suddenly appeared in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlight. The figure was draped in tattered clothes, its face obscured by shadows. It stood motionless, its presence creating an eerie, chilling aura that filled the car with an inexplicable sense of dread. Laura's heart raced as she slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the apparition. The ghostly figure remained unmoving, its stillness adding to the haunting atmosphere of the night. Laura's initial shock gave way to a creeping fear as she tried to comprehend the figure's presence. The apparition seemed to be a warning, a spectral sentinel standing guard against some unseen threat. As she attempted to start her car and back away, the ghostly figure slowly raised a hand, pointing down the road with an unsettling, deliberate gesture. The gesture felt like a dire warning, premonition of something far worse lurking in the darkness. Despite her fear, Laura felt compelled to follow the figure's silent direction. She cautiously drove forward, her headlights barely piercing the impenetrable darkness that enveloped the road. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the forest around her seemed to close in, trees casting ominous shadows that swayed and twisted in the darkness. The haunting presence of the apparition remained at the edge of her vision, a constant reminder of the danger that lay ahead. As Laura ventured further into the forest, the road began to twist and turn in increasingly bizarre ways. The once familiar landscape now felt like a distorted nightmare, with shadows moving in unsettling patterns, and the forest seeming to come alive with sinister intent. The apparition's ghostly warning took on a more urgent tone, as if it was guiding her away from a grave peril that was drawing ever closer. Suddenly, the road ahead split into several dark, foreboding paths, each one leading deeper into the forest. The ghostly figure was nowhere to be seen, but the sense of impending danger was palpable. Laura realized with growing terror that the apparition had led her into a treacherous trap, where each path represented a different facet of the looming threat. The once peaceful drive had become a chilling ordeal of survival, with the forest itself seeming to conspire against her. Driving through the barren expanse of the Nevada desert, Mark's car sputtered and groaned as it neared empty. The sun had long set, and the desert was shrouded in an oppressive darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of distant stars. In the midst of this vast nothingness, Mark spotted a faint light in the distance, a gas station that seemed to offer a glimmer of hope amidst the desolate landscape. Relieved, he steered his car towards it, eager to refuel and escape the relentless night. As Mark approached the gas station, he was struck by its unsettling appearance. The once bright neon signs were dim and flickering, casting an eerie, haunting glow over the deserted lot. The station's structure appeared rundown, with broken windows and peeling paint, yet the presence of fuel pumps was a welcome sight. Mark pulled up to the nearest pump, his sense of relief overshadowed by a growing feeling of unease. The station felt strangely out of place, like a mirage in the desert. After filling his tank, Mark tried to pay at the old-fashioned pump, but the machine was unresponsive. The light from the station seemed to flicker more erratically, and the once faint sounds of the desert, wind, distant animals, were replaced by an unsettling silence. A shiver ran down Mark's spine as he realized that the station had a faint, almost imperceptible quality to it, as if it was not entirely real. The oppressive darkness seemed to grow heavier, and the station's once reassuring presence became increasingly ominous. When Mark attempted to leave, he was stunned to find that the gas station had vanished. The spot where the station had stood was now an empty expanse of desert, illuminated only by the dim light of his car's headlights. The sensation of being trapped in a nightmare intensified as he turned around, hoping to retrace his path, only to find that the road behind him had disappeared into the inky blackness of the desert. The once familiar landscape was now an endless void, and the gas station had become a chilling memory. Mark's car, now illuminated only by its own headlights, seemed like a lone beacon in the vast desert. The endless darkness was broken only by the occasional distant star, and the oppressive silence made the situation feel even more surreal. He realized with growing panic that he was trapped in a nightmarish loop. The gas station's disappearance, leaving him stranded in a desert, seemed to stretch on forever. The feeling of isolation and the haunting disappearance of the station turned his ordeal into a desperate fight for survival. As the hours dragged on, Mark's hope of finding another source of help dwindled. The desert, which had once seemed like a vast but manageable expanse, now felt like an unforgiving, endless trap. The oppressive darkness and the haunting memory of the vanished gas station left him with a chilling sense of foreboding, as if the desert itself was conspiring to keep him from ever escaping. The isolation and the inexplicable disappearance of the station transformed his night into a terrifying struggle against the encroaching void. In the outskirts of Houston, Texas, Mark found himself driving along a stretch of road notorious for its frequent accidents. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly through the dark, only illumination coming from his headlights. As he drove, a chilling sense of déjà vu began to creep over him, each twist and turn of the road seeming hauntingly familiar. He brushed off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue from a long day's drive, but the unsettling sensation persisted. Suddenly, the road ahead seemed to shimmer and warp, and Mark was jolted as if transported back in time. The scene around him began to change, revealing horrifying glimpses of past accident. Crumpled cars, shattered glass, and the haunting screams of those who had met their end here. Chilling realization dawned on him. He was reliving the fatal moments of these past tragedies. Each new turn brought him face to face with another fatal collision. The scenes were playing with a disturbing clarity. Desperately trying to escape this nightmarish loop, Mark accelerated, hoping to outrun the gruesome vision. The road twisted and turned, seemingly alive with a malevolent force determined to trap him in this macabre cycle. Every attempt to break free only seemed to plunge him deeper into the cursed history of the road. The once familiar highway had transformed into a treacherous labyrinth, with the ghosts of past victims haunting every curve. The spectral apparitions of accident victims began to manifest more vividly, their ghostly forms reaching out as if pleading for help. Mark could feel the weight of their sorrow and anger pressing in on him, their spectral cries echoing in the confined space of his car. It was as if the road itself was trying to pull him into its dark past, determined to add him to its grim tally. The haunting vision of these lost souls was both terrifying and sorrowful, amplifying his desperation. In the outskirts of Houston, Texas, Mark found himself driving along a stretch of road notorious for its frequent accidents. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly through the dark, the only illumination coming from his headlights. As he drove, a chilling sense of déjà vu began to creep over him, each twist and turn of the road seeming hauntingly familiar. He He brushed off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue from a long day's drive, but the unsettling sensation persisted. Suddenly, the road ahead seemed to shimmer and warp, and Mark was jolted as if transported back in time. The scene around him began to change, revealing horrifying glimpses of past accident, crumpled cars, shattered glass, and the haunting screams of those who had met their end here. The chilling realization dawned on him. He was reliving the fatal moments of these past tragedies. Each new turn brought him face to face with another fatal collision, the scenes replaying with a disturbing clarity. Desperately trying to escape this nightmarish loop, Mark accelerated, hoping to outrun the gruesome visions. The road twisted and turned, seemingly alive with a malevolent force determined to trap him in this macabre cycle. Every attempt to break free only seemed to plunge him deeper into the cursed history of the road. The once familiar highway had transformed into a treacherous labyrinth, with the ghosts of past victims haunting every curve. The spectral apparitions of accident victims began to manifest more vividly, their ghostly forms reaching out as if pleading for help. Mark could feel the weight of their sorrow and anger pressing in on him, their spectral cries echoing in the confined space of his car. It was as if the road itself was trying to pull him into its dark past, determined to add him to its grim tally. The haunting vision of these lost souls was both terrifying and sorrowful, amplifying his desperation. Each mile seemed to stretch into eternity as the road twisted and changed, leading Mark deeper into the heart of the cursed stretch. His car's engine roared, and the headlights cut through the darkness, but the oppressive sense of dread never lifted. The road seemed endless, and the past accidents replayed with increasing frequency. Mark's fear escalated with each relived moment, the road becoming a living nightmare. The boundaries between past and present began to blur, and Mark felt as though he was being pulled into the scenes of the past. The chilling atmosphere was thick with the echoes of those who had died, their voices melding into a cacophony of despair and warning. Mark could barely distinguish between reality and the haunting visions surrounding him. Every attempt to escape seemed futile, with the cursed road seemingly bent on his destruction. In a final, desperate bid for freedom, Mark made a break for it, swerving off the road into the darkened woods. Familiar roads vanished behind him, and he hoped to find refuge in the isolation of the trees. Even in the darkened forest, the feeling of being watched and followed persisted. The shadows of the past seemed to loom ever larger, their presence inescapable. As he drove through the dense forest, Mark's hope of escaping the curse began to fade. Forest paths twisted and turned, mirroring the haunted road he had tried to escape. The chilling whispers of the past continued to haunt him, and the oppressive weight of the curse followed him like a shadow. He was trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Desperate and exhausted, Mark finally emerged from the forest, but the road he found was not the one he had left behind. It was a different, yet hauntingly familiar stretch of highway, as if he had been drawn into an alternate version of the cursed road. The line between reality and the supernatural had blurred beyond recognition, leaving Mark in a state of perpetual fear. Cursed roads seemed to have claimed him, and as Mark continued to drive through the darkness, he could feel the ghosts of the past swirling around him. The once familiar highway was now a twisted path of horror, with every mile a reminder of the tragic history he could never escape. The curse of the road had become his own, and he was doomed to relive its chilling, haunted past. Desperately, Sarah tried to reverse, but the bridge seemed to hold her in its grasp. The world outside her car grew darker, and the ghostly figures grew more aggressive, their spectral hands reaching through the mist. The bridge seemed to warp and stretch, elongating the nightmarish vision and intensifying the feeling of entrapment. The once familiar landscape had become a terrifying abyss, with the haunting past threatening to engulf her. In a frantic attempt to escape, Sarah floored the gas pedal, her car speeding through the bridge as the spectral figures closed in. The haunting cries and ghostly figures blurred into a chaotic whirlwind, the bridge seeming to elongate further into the nightmarish void. The oppressive darkness grew thicker, and the eerie glow of the moonlight did little to dispel the terrifying visions that surrounded her. As Sarah finally burst through the far end of the bridge, she was met with a chilling silence. The mist began to dissipate, and the haunting visions faded, leaving her breathless and disoriented. The bridge receded into the darkness behind her, its malevolent presence now a chilling memory. But the sense of dread lingered, a haunting reminder of the dark history she had narrowly escaped. While on a road trip through the rugged landscapes of Montana, Jake took a wrong turn, hoping to find a shortcut to his destination. The path was barely visible, obscured by overgrown vegetation and the shadows of the towering mountains. The road, long forgotten and abandoned, seemed to lead nowhere, yet curiosity drove him to follow it. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, with each passing mile intensifying the sense of isolation. After what felt like hours of navigating the winding path, Jake emerged into a clearing, only to discover an old ghost town that appeared almost frozen in time. The buildings, weathered and crumbling, stood silent under the fading light of dusk. The town seemed to be a relic of a bygone era, its streets empty and silent. Despite the haunting appearance of the place, Jake felt a strange pull to explore further, drawn by the eerie stillness that enveloped the ghost town. As Jake wandered through the abandoned streets, he began to notice unsettling details. The windows of the old buildings were covered in grime and cobwebs, but occasionally he glimpsed shadowy figures moving behind the glass. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant creaking of old structures and the whisper of the wind. The town's unsettling atmosphere grew more oppressive, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The deeper Jake ventured into the ghost town, the more he encountered the spectral residents. They were ghostly figures with hollow eyes and forlorn expressions, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. Each spirit seemed to reach out, their eyes pleading for release from their spectral imprisonment. The haunting presence of these trapped souls was palpable, their sorrowful wails blending with the eerie silence of the deserted town. Jake tried to communicate with the apparitions, but their responses were hauntingly vague, as if they were trapped in a state of perpetual despair. The spirits seemed to be bound to the town, unable to move on or find peace. The sense of being in the midst of a tragic, eternal limbo was overwhelming. It became clear that the ghost town was not just a relic of the past, but a place where souls remained trapped, endlessly seeking release from their torment. Desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere and the relentless ghostly presence, Jake searched for a way out of the town. The paths he had once traversed now seemed to shift and twist, leading him deeper into the heart of the haunting. The once clear route out of the ghost town had become a maze of shifting shadows and spectral figures, each turn only deepening his sense of entrapment. Late one night, David was driving alone along a deserted highway in the vast expanse of Utah, the road stretching endlessly beneath the star-studded sky. The isolation was absolute, nothing but the hum of his car and the occasional flicker of distant lights on the horizon. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, but the emptiness around him felt hauntingly profound. The road, bathed in a cold, eerie glow, seemed to hold secrets that were just beyond his perception. Suddenly, as David drove through a particularly dark stretch of the highway, he noticed figures flickering in and out of the beam of his headlights. At first, they seemed like mirages, shadows of passing travelers or tricks of the light. But as the figures grew more distinct, he realized they were spectral apparitions, each appearing only for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. These ghostly forms seemed to be trying to convey something, their presence both chilling and sorrowful. With each ghostly figure that appeared, David saw glimpses of their tragic stories. One figure was a young woman, her eyes wide with fear and sadness as she reached out with a silent cry. Another was a man in old-fashioned clothing, his face marked with the pain of a bygone era. Each apparition was unique, their spectral forms shifting and fading with the rhythm of his headlights, revealing fragments of their sorrowful tales in brief, haunting glimpses. The spectral figures seemed to be reaching out to David as if desperate for him to understand their plight. Their appearances were fleeting, disappearing almost as soon as he tried to focus on them. The highway itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows of the ghosts merging with the darkness of the road. The feeling of being watched and the weight of their unspoken stories grew heavier, pressing in on David as he tried to make sense of the haunting parade. As David continued down the highway, the ghostly figures became more insistent, their appearances growing more frequent and desperate. The stories they represented began to intertwine, creating a chilling tapestry of loss and longing. Each figure seemed to be guiding him, leading him further down the spectral highway, as if their tragic fates were somehow linked to his own journey. The road seemed endless, and the ghost's presence grew more overwhelming with each passing mile. In a desperate bid to escape the ghostly procession, David tried to accelerate, hoping to outrun the spectral figures. However, the highway appeared to stretch out indefinitely, the ghost's forms flickering with a relentless persistence. The sense of being trapped in a never-ending loop of sorrowful apparitions became more intense, as if the highway itself was a conduit for their restless spirits. The chilling realization dawned on him. The spectral highway was not just a path through the desert, but a corridor of tragic souls forever reaching out for release. In the heart of the dense woods of Maine, Lisa decided to take a brief detour from her road trip, drawn by the promise of a scenic drive through the forest. As she pulled over at a forest entrance, the surroundings took on a strangely serene, yet unsettling quality. The towering trees formed a natural archway, their leaves rustling softly in the faint breeze. The transition from the open road to the dense forest was immediate, and the silence that greeted her was anything but comforting. The forest's silence was profound, almost unnatural. It was as if the usual forest sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional call of wildlife, had been swallowed by an oppressive stillness. Lisa could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, making the air seem thicker and more oppressive. The stillness felt like a living entity, an eerie prelude to something that lay hidden just beyond her vision. As Lisa stepped out of her car to explore, the sense of unease grew. The forest was vast and dark, the sunlight barely penetrating the dense canopy overhead. The silence was all-encompassing, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The deeper she ventured into the forest, the more the silence seemed to close in, creating a disorienting feeling of being completely alone. The forest's shadows seemed to lengthen and twist, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Without warning, the silence was shattered by a sudden rustling in the underbrush. Lisa's heart raced as she scanned the darkness, her flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The rustling grew louder and more frantic, as if something or someone was moving swiftly through the forest. The unnerving quiet was replaced by an ominous rustling sound that seemed to follow her every move, amplifying her sense of dread. The source of the disturbance soon became clear. Emerging from the shadows were figures that seemed to materialize from the very essence of the forest. They were shadowy, indistinct forms with vague, menacing shapes. Their presence was accompanied by a haunting whispering that seemed to come from all directions, filling the silence with an eerie chorus of voices. These figures seemed intent on drawing her deeper into the forest. Their movements synchronized with the increasing intensity of the whispering. Lisa's attempts to retrace her steps were in vain. The forest seemed to shift and change around her, the once familiar path now a labyrinth of darkness and shadows. The figures moved closer, their ghostly forms growing more defined and menacing. The whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from eerie murmurs to chilling threats. Lisa's fear escalated as she realized that the forest was not just a place of natural beauty, but a trap, designed to ensnare those who ventured too far. Desperate to escape, Lisa pushed through the darkness, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest silence was now a distant memory, replaced by the haunting presence of the figures and the relentless whispering. The oppressive stillness had been a mere prelude to the hidden danger that lurked within the depths of the forest. With each step, Lisa felt the forest closing in around her, its malevolent intent clear in the shifting shadows and the increasing pressure of the whispering voices. On a quiet evening drive through rural Mississippi, Tom noticed something unusual by the side of the road. The setting sun cast long shadows over the landscape, and there, half hidden by overgrown grass, was an unmarked grave. The grave's simple appearance, with no headstone or marker, struck Tom as both eerie and intriguing. He decided to pull over, driven by a mix of curiosity and a sense of foreboding. The grave seemed out of place in the tranquil countryside, its presence whispering of secrets long buried. As Tom stepped out of his car and approached the grave, a chill ran down his spine. The ground around the grave was disturbed. The soil recently turned as if someone had been there. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence enveloped him. Tom began to dig carefully, hoping to uncover some clue about the identity of the deceased. What he found instead was a series of old, faded objects. A rusted locket, tarnished ring, and a worn piece of fabric. Each item seemed to tell a story of a life ended too soon. The deeper Tom dug, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The objects he uncovered were accompanied by a growing sense of unease, as if the grave itself was trying to communicate its anguish. A local legend Tom had heard in passing began to resurface in his mind. A story about a vengeful spirit buried alongside the road, seeking retribution for a betrayal that led to its untimely death. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary grave, but one tied to a dark and tragic past. As twilight descended, the grave seemed to come alive with a haunting energy. The air grew thick with an ominous presence, and Tom could feel a palpable sense of anger and sorrow emanating from the disturbed earth. Shadows seemed to lengthen and warp, and the whisper of the local legend grew louder in his mind. The vengeful spirit, according to the tale, was a restless soul seeking justice for a crime committed long ago. Tom began to sense that the spirit's anger was directed at him, the unwitting intruder. The situation escalated quickly as Tom felt an icy breeze brush against his neck. He glanced around, his heart racing, and saw ghostly figures emerging from the darkness. The apparitions were barely visible, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows. They seemed to be reaching out, their spectral hands trying to pull him closer to the grave. The whispers of the vengeful spirit grew louder, their voices a haunting chorus of grief and rage. Desperate to escape the mounting terror, Tom abandoned his digging and raced back to his car. The spectral figures seemed to follow him, their presence growing more oppressive as he tried to flee. The grave, now partially uncovered, seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the whispering voices echoed in his ears. As Tom sped away, the figures faded, but the sense of dread lingered, leaving him with a chilling memory of the roadside grave and the vengeful spirit lay beneath. True scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. You know, I've been trucking through all kinds of roads for years, seen a lot, been through a lot. But there's one night I still can't shake, no matter how many miles I put between me and the Appalachians. It was one of those foggy nights, you know the kind. The kind where the road just disappears in front of you, and you feel like you're driving into nothing. I was cruising down a narrow stretch in the mountains when I noticed this convoy of trucks ahead, and something didn't sit right. They were driving all wrong, swerving like they were trying to lose someone, or worse, keep someone in line. First, I figured they were just careless, maybe some inexperienced drivers. But as I got closer, the fog lifted just enough for me to get a better look. And what I saw? Well, it sent a chill down my spine. The trucks looked like regular rigs, but they had this eerie way of sticking together, almost too perfect. And the drivers? All masked up, eyes forward, like they were locked onto some mission. That's when it hit me. I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have. I tried to ease off, let them go on their way. Before I knew it, the lead truck slowed down. And the trucks behind me? Well, they boxed me in. Just like that, I was trapped. My heart started pounding, and I knew I was in deep. These guys weren't just reckless. They were up to something, and now I was part of it, whether I liked it or not. I hit the gas, trying to break free. My truck roared down the road, but those guys stayed right on my tail like shadows chasing me through the fog. Every curve, every turn, I was sure I'd lose control. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I could feel their headlights burning into the back of my rig, like they were hunting me down. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a crash. One of the trucks behind me hit something, hard. I didn't look back. I didn't have time to. My only focus was on the road ahead, but the fog kept creeping back in, thick and suffocating. Felt like the mountains were closing in on me, the dark trees on either side standing tall like silent witnesses. It was eerie, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. But I couldn't panic. Not yet. There was a sharp turn up ahead, one I knew could either save me or send me straight off the mountain. I took it. Tires screeched, and for a moment I thought I'd lost it. But I held on, gripping the wheel like my life depended on it. 'Cause, honestly, it did. As I rounded that bend, the headlights behind me disappeared, swallowed up by the fog and distance. Thought I was in the clear. That feeling of safety didn't last. You ever feel like you're being watched even when you're alone? That's what it was like. I pulled into this old, rundown rest stop, parked my truck, and just sat there, staring out into the darkness. My pulse was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for the right moment. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and the quiet only made it worse. It was too quiet. I kept thinking about those trucks, those masked drivers, and the way they moved in perfect sync, like they had done this before. It was chilling. I didn't know what they were running, but I knew I wanted no part of it. Then, just as I was starting to relax, thinking maybe I'd outrun them, I saw it. A pair of headlights in the distance, slowly coming toward me. My heart dropped. They hadn't given up. They weren't done. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't just running from them. I was running from whatever secret they were protecting. Something haunting. Something dangerous. I threw my truck into gear and hit the road again, not looking back this time. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was far, far away from that eerie convoy. That night taught me something. Sometimes it's not what you see that scares you. It's what you don't. The things left in the dark, the chilling secrets people carry with them, hidden in plain sight. So if you ever find yourself on a desolate road and you spot a convoy driving just a little too perfectly, do yourself a favor. Keep your distance. Because once they spot you, there's no turning back. And trust me, you don't want to be part of their story. You ever been so low on gas, you could practically hear the engine begging for mercy? That was me, smack dab in the middle of the Arizona desert, sun dipping low on the horizon. I'd been driving for hours, and my gas gauge was hovering on empty. Just when I was about to give up hope, I spotted this gas station in the distance, like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. It looked old, abandoned even, but I didn't have much choice. As I pulled in, the place was eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. There were no cars, no signs of life, and the pumps looked like they hadn't seen a customer in years. Desperate times, right? I got out, filled up my tank, and as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Air was still, too still. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. I tried to pay, but the card reader was dead, so I figured I'd pay inside. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty shop. Shelves were covered in dust, and the lights flickered like something out of a bad horror movie. No one was there. No clerk, no nothing. Just this eerie, abandoned feeling that made my skin crawl. I left some cash on the counter, didn't want any trouble, and got the hell out of there. I hit the road again, feeling a little uneasy, but glad to be moving. Then, not 5 miles later, I saw it again. Same gas station, sitting there like I hadn't just left it. My heart skipped a beat. I thought maybe I was seeing things, heat exhaustion or something. But no, it was real, down to the same busted pumps and flickering lights. Confused, I kept driving, pushing the thought out of my head. Maybe I'd just made a wrong turn and circled back. That happens, right? But then I saw it again. The same gas station, in the same spot, like it was following me. That's when it hit me. I wasn't going in circles. Something else was happening here. Something chilling. I slammed on the brakes, my hands shaking on the wheel. This couldn't be real. I was too far out in the desert. No landmarks, no towns, just endless road. The gas station? It was haunting me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I thought about going back, but the idea of stepping foot in that place again sent a shiver down my spine. So I kept driving, faster this time. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I covered, there it was, up ahead. The same station, the same pumps, the same eerie silence. It was like I was trapped, the road pulling me into some kind of twisted loop. I was running out of options, running out of sanity. And then, out of nowhere, I spotted headlights in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me. Another car. Maybe they could help, or at least tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But as the car got closer, I realized something wasn't right. They were following too closely, like they were watching me. My stomach dropped. Was this some kind of setup? Suddenly, the car sped up, swerving into my lane, trying to force me off the road. Panic set in. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't here to help. I floored it, my heart racing as I tried to shake them. The headlights blinded me in my mirror, getting closer, more aggressive. Felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I took a sharp turn, hoping to lose them. The car stayed on me. And there, just up ahead, was the gas station again. But this time, there were people. Figures standing outside, watching, waiting. My hands tightened on the wheel, fear clawing at my throat. This wasn't just a coincidence. I was being hunted. In a split-second decision, I veered off the road, kicking up dust as I tore through the desert, away from the road, away from the station. The car behind me didn't follow. I don't know if they lost sight of me or if they didn't care, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove until the gas light came on again, far from that chilling place. Eventually, I found my way to a small town, a real one this time. I never saw that gas station again. But I'll tell you this, you're ever out in the Arizona desert, running low on gas, and you see an old, broken-down station, keep driving. Don't stop. You never know what might be waiting for you out there. There's something about those back roads in Maine that feels both peaceful and unnerving at the same time. My partner and I had been driving all day, taking in the sights, enjoying the isolation. The trees were thick, lining the road like towering sentinels, and we relied on the GPS to guide us. It was one of those quiet drives where the only sound was the hum of the car engine and the occasional crackle of leaves under the tires. Then the GPS pinged, telling us to take a detour down a narrow dirt road. At first it seemed fine, just a little bumpy. We weren't in a rush, so we figured, why not? But as the road grew narrower, we started getting that eerie feeling, like the woods were closing in on us. The trees loomed taller, the light fading as dusk settled in. And the road, well, it was less of a road, and more like a path that hadn't seen a vehicle in years. I glanced over at my partner, and we both knew something wasn't right. About 5 minutes in, the GPS lost signal, and we were left with nothing but instinct. I pulled the car to a stop, trying to get a sense of where we were. That's when we noticed it. The silent. Not the usual peaceful quiet of the woods, but an unsettling, almost oppressive kind of silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just stillness. It sent a chill down my spine. We decided to turn back. That's when things went from bad to worse. As I reversed, the car's back tire hit something, a rock maybe, and the whole thing lurched. We were stuck. Got out to check, and sure enough, tire was lodged deep in a rut. Frustration mixed with fear as I tried to free it. No luck. My partner started getting nervous, asking if we should call for help. But we had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Then we saw them. Through the trees, just barely visible, were figures. At first I thought maybe they were hikers, but something about them seemed off. They weren't moving like hikers. They were just standing there watching. My heart began to race. Who were they? And why weren't they coming over to help? My partner whispered, "We need to go, now." Panic set in as I got back in the car, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I slammed on the gas, but the tire wouldn't budge. The figures were getting closer now, moving slowly, almost deliberately. It was then that I realized they weren't lost hikers. They were locals, protecting something. And we had just stumbled onto their hidden operation, whatever it was. I tried the gas again, harder this time, and finally, tire broke free. The car shot forward, and I spun the wheel, trying to get us back onto the road. But the locals weren't backing down. They started running toward us, yelling something I couldn't make out. My partner screamed, "Go, go, go," and I floored it, dirt and gravel kicking up behind us as we sped away. The road was too narrow to go fast, and the trees seemed to close in even more as we tore down the path. Every second felt like a lifetime, my hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding in my chest. Figures chased us for a while, but eventually they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the forest's shadows. We didn't stop. We couldn't. Not until we reached the main road again. Even then, the tension didn't leave us. That eerie silence of the woods still clung to me, like it had followed us out of the trees. Whatever those people were protecting, it wasn't something they wanted the world to see. And we had come too close. It took us hours to calm down, feel like we were safe again. That night changed everything for us. We learned that not every road leads somewhere you want to go, and sometimes those hidden paths are best left alone. If your GPS ever tells you to take a detour in the middle of nowhere, do yourself a favor, don't take it. Then, as we rounded a bend, we saw it. Car broken down on the side of the road, just like the broadcast had predicted. My heart pounded in my chest as we passed it, and for a second I considered stopping. Something told me to keep going. The radio crackled again, this time louder, more urgent. A new message came through, and this time it mentioned us directly. The voice described our car, right down to the make, model, and color, and said we'd be involved in a collision within the next 10 miles. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My partner grabbed my arm, face pale. "This isn't normal," she whispered, her voice trembling. I could barely think straight, my mind racing. What was happening? How could the radio know so much? Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. A van, tailgating us, way too close for comfort. My pulse quickened. It was like they were trying to push us off the road. I tried to speed up. The van matched our pace. The broadcast continued in the background, and the tension was unbearable. We were trapped, stuck between the voice on the radio and the van behind us. It was supposed to be a normal family road trip through Kansas, kind where you pack too many snacks, play cheesy music, and enjoy the open road. We were driving through miles of flat plains, the sky stretching out endlessly, when the radio started crackling. Nothing unusual at first, just static. But then, through the static, we heard something chilling. A voice, calm and steady, was reading off a list of accidents and emergencies happening nearby. I thought it was one of those local emergency broadcasts, but something about it felt eerie. The voice was too calm, almost robotic, and the details were too specific. A crash on Highway 7, 3 miles west of where we were. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I glanced at my partner. We hadn't seen an accident yet. We kept driving, trying to ignore it, but then the voice continued. It described a breakdown on the same highway, exactly where we were heading. My stomach turned. It was as if the broadcast was predicting events that hadn't even happened yet. And what was worse, it ended with something that made my heart skip a beat. A fatal collision involving a family of 4. There were 4 of us in the car. My hands tightened on the wheel. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was growing thick. like an invisible force wrapping around us. My partner fiddled with the radio, trying to change the station, but every channel was the same. The same voice, the same disturbing broadcast. I could feel the air in the car shift, heavy and oppressive. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the wheel, determined to keep control. The van swerved closer, its headlights blinding us in the mirrors. My partner turned the radio off, but the silence was even worse. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get away. But there was nowhere to go, just miles of empty road and the looming sense that something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, the van swerved into the oncoming lane, racing ahead of us. My heart pounded as it passed, but instead of continuing on, it stopped, blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as we came to a stop just in time. The van's driver got out, but I didn't wait to see who it was. I threw the car into reverse, backing up as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We took the nearest exit, speeding away from the highway, from the van, and from whatever was controlling that radio. We didn't stop until we reached a small diner, miles away from where it all happened. As we sat there, trying to catch our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse than a collision. The radio never played that broadcast again, but I'll never forget it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't listened. We had kept driving toward whatever fate that voice predicted. But one thing's for sure. Next time the radio crackles with static, I'll be turning it off. You never know who or what might be on the other side. It was just another late-night run. I'd been driving for hours, the road stretching out endlessly in front of me. By the time I pulled into that isolated truck stop, clock was creeping past midnight, and the parking lot was nearly empty. There's something chilling about a deserted truck stop in the middle of nowhere. The only light came from a flickering neon sign, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. But all I needed was some coffee and a few minutes to stretch my legs before getting back on the road. As I stepped inside, the place was as empty as the lot. Few tables scattered around, an old counter with one tired-looking coffee machine sputtering away. I filled up my cup and leaned against the counter, savoring the warmth. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting in the corner, staring out the window. He looked out of place, wearing a dirty jacket, his face hidden in shadows. Something about him made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but as I turned to leave, he spoke. "Long haul tonight, huh?" His voice was low, almost too calm for someone sitting alone at a truck stop this late. I nodded, not wanting to get into a conversation. But he kept talking. "You headed toward I-70? Dangerous road this time of night." That caught my attention. I hadn't mentioned where I was going. My heart started to pound as he continued. "You should be careful. There are people out there, looking for trucks like yours. Big rigs, valuable cargo. They don't care who's driving." His eyes flicked toward me, cold and calculating. I didn't like the way he was looking at me, like he knew more than he should. I felt an eerie sense of dread creeping in, like the air in the room had suddenly turned heavier. I mumbled something about needing to get back on the road and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, he called after me, "Watch your back out there." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I shook it off. People talk, rumors spread. I wasn't going to let some stranger at a truck stop mess with my head. I got back in my rig, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway. The night felt darker, road stretching out like a black ribbon in front of me. I tried to push the man's words out of my mind, but they clung to me, haunting my thoughts. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something, anything, following me. But there was nothing, just empty highway. That's when the headlights appeared, far behind me at first, but getting closer. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. The truck from the stop was gaining on me, fast. My heart raced. Was it him? Was this what he'd meant by people looking for trucks? I wasn't about to wait and find out. I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped up, but the headlights stayed locked onto me. Panic set in as the truck tailgated me, its high beams blinding me through the mirrors. I swerved, trying to shake it, but it only got closer, almost forcing me off the road. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the road ahead blurred as I tried to focus. Whoever was behind me wasn't just messing around. They were trying to run me off the road. I had no choice. I needed to lose them, and fast. Up ahead, I spotted a turnoff, a narrow road leading into the woods. I took it, tires screeching as I turned sharply, hoping to disappear into the trees. The truck followed, but the road was too tight for both of us. I could hear the crunch of gravel and the roar of their engine as they tried to keep up. The darkness closed in around me as I sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of my rig. The truck behind me slowed, its headlights fading into the distance. I wasn't sure if they'd given up or if they were just waiting for another chance. But I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached a small rest area miles away, hidden from the highway. I parked the truck and sat there, heart still racing, hands gripping the wheel. The stranger's words echoed in my head. "Watch your back out there." He knew. Somehow, he knew. I wasn't sure if he was part of it or just a warning, but one thing was clear. There are dangerous people out there on those empty roads. People who see truckers as easy targets. I never saw that man again, and I never drove that route at night after that. Sometimes you get warnings you shouldn't ignore, even if they come from the last person you'd expect. Next time you're at a truck stop and a stranger gives you advice, maybe it's best to listen. You never know what might be waiting for you on the road. We were supposed to be on a simple road trip, just me and a couple of friends, cruising through the Rockies. The kind of trip where you stop for gas, grab some snacks, and enjoy the views. The mountains were beautiful, towering above us, but as the sun began to set, we found ourselves on a narrow, winding road with no other cars in sight. That's when our GPS suggested a shortcut, a rural bridge that would supposedly save us hours. It sounded perfect at the time, but the moment we turned onto the road, something felt off. The bridge came into view, an old rickety thing that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It stretched across a deep ravine with jagged rocks far below. Eerie creaking of the wood as we approached sent a chill through the car. But we pressed on, convincing ourselves it was safe. As we reached the middle of the bridge, we noticed something strange. On the far side, a group of people stood, watching us. At first I thought they were just locals, maybe travelers like us. But the closer we got, the more unsettling it became. They weren't moving, just standing there, blocking the exit, their faces hidden in the fading light. My heart began to race. We slowed down, unsure of what to do. The bridge was too narrow to turn around, and reversing would be nearly impossible without going off the edge. The tension in the car was thick. My friend in the back whispered, "I don't like this." And none of us disagreed. Something about the way they stood there, waiting, was chilling. Suddenly, one of them stepped forward, waving their arms for us to stop. My gut screamed that we shouldn't, but what choice did we have? I pulled the car to a halt, just a few feet from where they stood. That's when the reality hit me. These weren't locals. They were guarding the bridge, and we just walked into something we had no business being a part of. Before we could react, they started walking toward us. My hands gripped the steering wheel as panic set in. We were trapped. There was no way forward, and going back felt like a death sentence. One of the men stepped up to the driver's side window, his face shadowed. He tapped on the glass, and I rolled it down just enough to hear him. "Turn around," he said, his voice low and cold. "You don't belong here." My heart pounded in my chest. His eyes were hard, dangerous. I nodded, but I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. As I shifted into reverse, I saw more of them moving closer, surrounding the car. We were stuck, pinned in by these people who clearly didn't want us to leave. I tried to stay calm. The fear was palpable. My friends were whispering, panicking, and I could feel the walls closing in. The bridge groaned under the weight of the car as we inched backward, but the group wasn't backing off. They were closing in, slowly but surely. One of them banged on the back window, and I nearly lost it. "Go faster," my friend yelled, her voice shaking. The bridge was narrow, too narrow for us to make a quick escape, but we had no choice. I slammed on the gas, praying the tires wouldn't slip off the edge. Car lurched backward, and for a moment, I thought we were going to make it. But then, out of nowhere, one of the men threw something at the windshield. It shattered, glass flying everywhere. Panic turned into full-blown terror. I floored it, the car swerving dangerously close to the edge of the ravine. My friends screamed, gripping their seats, as I fought to keep us on the bridge. Figures faded into the distance. But I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. They wanted us gone, and they'd make sure we didn't talk about whatever we'd seen. We finally made it off the bridge and back onto the main road. Hearts racing, hands shaking. The silence in the car was deafening as we sped away from that place, our minds reeling. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the Rockies now a haunting memory instead of a scenic backdrop. I don't know what those people were guarding or why they were so determined to keep us out, but I do know this: some roads aren't worth the shortcut. Next time you find yourself on a rural bridge in the middle of nowhere, think twice before crossing. You never know what might be waiting on the other side. It was late, and we were driving through the desolate back roads of Texas. Kind of roads where you can go miles without seeing another car. My partner and I were heading home from a long trip, and the sky was pitch black, with only the faint glow of our headlights cutting through the night. That's when we saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, waving us down. He looked rough, like he'd been out there for hours. We pulled over, not because we wanted to, but because something about his desperate expression got to us. He stumbled over to the car, limping slightly, and when we rolled down the window, he asked if we could give him a ride. His voice was shaky, like he'd been running from something. "Please," he said, "someone's after me." It sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't want to leave him stranded. Against my better judgment, we let him in. He looked paranoid, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something or someone to appear out of the darkness. "What happened?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but the unease in my chest was growing. He didn't answer right away, just muttered something about a truck that had been following him for miles. He said they'd tried to run him off the road, and now he was running for his life. The road stretched on in front of us, and with every mile, the tension in the car grew thicker. My partner and I exchanged nervous glances, but we didn't say much. It wasn't long before I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. My heart sank. A truck was coming up behind us, and fast. "Is that them?" my partner whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man in the back seat stiffened, his eyes wide with fear. "That's them," he muttered. "They found me." My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the truck closed in, its headlights blinding us through the mirrors. My stomach twisted with dread. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't playing around. The truck swerved closer, and I realized this wasn't just about the hitchhiker. Now, we were part of it too. I hit the gas, trying to put some distance between us and the truck, but it stayed right on our tail, engine roaring like a beast chasing its prey. The road was long and straight, no turnoffs, no way to lose them. My heart pounded in my chest as the truck swerved closer, the headlights burning into the back of our car. I could feel the panic rising in the car, everyone's breath quickening, the sense of doom closing in. The truck came even closer, its front bumper almost touching ours. It was playing a dangerous game, one that could end in disaster if I didn't keep control. My partner was gripping the seat, eyes wide with terror, and the hitchhiker was muttering under his breath, like he knew what was coming. I had to think fast. There had to be a way out. Up ahead, I saw it. A narrow dirt road, barely visible in the dark, but it was my only option. I swerved onto it, the tires kicking up dust as we sped down the bumpy path. Truck followed for a moment, but then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. I glanced in the mirror, and the headlights were gone. The truck had vanished into the night. We slowed down, the car rattling on the rough road. For a moment, none of us spoke, the air in the car thick with the eerie quiet that followed the chase. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. The hitchhiker slumped back in his seat, eyes closed, as if he'd just escaped a nightmare. But something about it didn't feel over. We dropped him off at the nearest town, a quiet little place where he disappeared into the night without saying much more. My partner and I were left sitting in the car, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. We had barely escaped with our lives. The whole drive home, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights appear again, but they never did. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were caught up in something far bigger than just a hitchhiker running from a truck. It felt like we'd stepped into someone else's nightmare, and we were lucky to have gotten out. But if I ever see a hitchhiker waving me down on a deserted road again, I don't think I'll stop. Sometimes it's better to keep driving. It's funny how driving through the Nevada desert at night feels like you're the only person left on Earth. The road stretches on for miles, and the only company you have is the stars. That's where I was, on a solo trip to clear my head, when I first noticed the headlight. First, they were just a small glimmer in the rearview mirror, way off in the distance. I didn't think much of it. Plenty of cars drive these lonely highways. But something about those lights felt off. For miles, they stayed just far enough behind me to be noticeable, but never close enough to pass. It was eerie. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just another driver headed in the same direction. But the longer I drove, the more unsettling it became. Those lights followed every turn, every curve, staying at a perfect distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind the wheel wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere, but they weren't letting me out of their sight either. The road was empty, nothing but desert on either side, and with every mile, the silence inside the car seemed to grow louder. I tried to focus on the road ahead. The headlights in my rearview mirror were like a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. My heart started to race, that creeping dread settling in. It was almost like they were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. Then, without warning, the car behind me sped up. I glanced in the mirror just in time to see it closing in fast. Panic set in. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas, but the car followed, matching my speed. My heart pounded in my chest, and my palms started to sweat. What was going on? Why was this person chasing me through the middle of nowhere? I pushed the car faster, the engine roaring as I tried to shake them. But the headlights stayed locked onto me, getting closer by the second. I didn't know what to do. There were no exits, no towns, just miles of empty road ahead. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. All I knew was that I had to get away. I swerved into the opposite lane, hoping they'd pass or back off. But they didn't. Instead, they stayed right behind me, like a predator toying with its prey. The road stretched out like a never-ending nightmare, and I was trapped in it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Whoever this was, they weren't just messing with me. They were after me. Then, just as quickly as they had sped up, the car vanished. 1 second they were there, blinding me with their high beams, and the next, the road behind me was empty. I couldn't believe it. My eyes darted to the mirrors, but there was nothing. No car, no lights, just darkness. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I slowed down cautiously, my heart still racing. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. A few minutes later, the headlights reappeared in the distance. They weren't gone. They were just waiting for me to drop my guard. My pulse quickened again, that same feeling of dread tightening its grip. I hit the gas, harder this time, desperate to put as much distance between us as I could. But it didn't matter. The car behind me was back, and this time it was coming faster. I don't know how long the chase lasted. Minutes? Hours? Felt like an eternity. The car stayed with me, relentless, like a shadow I couldn't shake. My mind was racing with fear and confusion. Who was this? What did they want? I pushed my car as fast as it could go, the engine roaring in protest, but no matter how fast I went, the headlights stayed locked on me. And then, just like before, the car vanished again. This time, for good. I drove for what felt like hours, never seeing another car, never hearing another sound. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, the desert surrounding me like a vast, empty void. By the time I reached the next town, the sun was rising. and I felt like I'd escaped some kind of nightmare. To this day, I don't know who was driving that car or why they were chasing me. Maybe it was some twisted game, or maybe I had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But one thing's for sure, driving alone on a desert highway at night isn't the peaceful escape you think it'll be. Sometimes something or someone is out there, and they're not just passing through. It started as a normal bus ride, nothing out of the ordinary. We were heading through the Louisiana Bayou, miles from the nearest town. It was one of those long stretches of road where there's nothing but swamp on either side. The kind of place where you feel completely cut off from the world. The bus was full of travelers like me, people just passing through. Then, something went wrong. The engine sputtered, and the bus slowly rolled to a stop on the side of the road. At first, we didn't think much of it. The driver got out to check the engine, and we all sat there, waiting. But as the minutes ticked by, that waiting started to feel eerie. There was no signal on our phones, no way to contact anyone. The swamp seemed to swallow the road, thick trees pressing in on either side. The air inside the bus grew heavy, and I could feel the tension building among the passengers. Something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, 2 men appeared from the trees. They looked like they belonged to the swamp. Dirty clothes, sunken eyes. They approached the bus, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The driver waved them over, like he knew them, and they started talking in low voices. That's when I realized these weren't just good Samaritans offering help. There was something chilling about the way they looked at the bus, like they were sizing us up. The driver came back on board, his face pale. "We're going to need to ride with these guys," he said, his voice shaky. "They'll take us to the nearest town." The whole bus erupted in murmurs, people questioning, protesting. The 2 men just stood there, watching, waiting for us to comply. I didn't trust them. Something felt wrong, haunting even. What choice did we have? We stepped off the bus, one by one, our footsteps echoing in the silence of the swamp. The men led us down a narrow path, away from the road, deeper into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get away from these men. But I didn't. None of us did. We followed, like sheep being led to the slaughter. As we walked, I noticed the 2 men whispering to each other, glancing back at us with those cold, calculating eyes. They weren't taking us to a town. They were leading us into a trap. I nudged the person next to me, trying to gauge if they felt the same creeping dread I did. They nodded, their face pale with fear. We were in serious trouble. Suddenly, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there it was. A boat, waiting at the edge of the water. My stomach dropped. Men smiled, revealing the plan we all feared. "Get in," one of them growled, motioning toward the boat. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a rescue. This was a hijacking. They weren't taking us anywhere safe. Panic set in among the group. People started backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The swamp surrounded us on all sides, and those men, they weren't going to let us leave. My heart raced, air thick with fear. One of the passengers, a brave soul, tried to make a run for it, darting back toward the path. But he didn't get far. One of the men grabbed him, dragging him back to the group. I knew we had to act fast. If we didn't, we'd be at their mercy. I whispered to the others, telling them we needed to make a break for it all at once. Strength in numbers, right? They hesitated, fear gripping them as tightly as it did me. But we didn't have time to hesitate. The men were growing impatient, their faces darkening with anger. On the count of 3, we made our move. Chaos erupted as we scattered in different directions, running through the trees, desperate to escape. I could hear the men shouting behind us, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. My heart pounded as I pushed through the thick swamp, branches whipping against my face. I didn't look back. I ran until I couldn't hear them anymore. Until the only sound was the ragged breath in my chest and the distant croak of frogs in the swamp. Somehow, I made it back to the road, my legs shaking, my clothes soaked with sweat. Few others stumbled out behind me, just as shaken as I was. But not everyone made it. Some were still out there, trapped in the swamp, in the hands of those men. We flagged down a passing car and got to safety. but the memory of that day still haunts me. The bayou might look peaceful, but there are dark things hiding in those trees. If you ever find yourself stranded in the middle of nowhere, remember, sometimes the people offering help are the ones you need to run from. We were lucky to escape. Not everyone was. I've always been a careful driver, especially at night when the highways are nearly empty. There's something chilling about being alone on a dark stretch of road, with nothing but your headlights cutting through the blackness. That's where I found myself, cruising down a lonely highway one evening. The sky was inky, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started with headlights in the distance, barely noticeable at first. But soon, they were right behind me, much too close for comfort. Glanced in the rearview mirror, my pulse quickening. The car behind me was tailgating, so close I could see their high beams glaring in my mirrors. I figured they'd pass, but they didn't. They just stayed there, dangerously close, like they were trying to push me along. I changed lanes, hoping they'd go around me, but they followed. My heart sank. This wasn't just some impatient driver. Whoever was behind the wheel was doing this on purpose. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as the car swerved closer, almost clipping my bumper. I could feel my breath quicken. Peaceful night turning into something eerie and threatening. I tried speeding up, but the car kept pace, always on my tail. My mind raced, wondering what I'd done to set them off. Was this just road rage, or was it something worse? The headlights in my mirror were blinding, filling my vision with bright, white light. My hands were shaking, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. Then they started honking, loud and aggressive. I could hear the engine of their car roaring as they surged forward, bumping into the back of mine. My heart leapt into my throat. This was no accident. They were trying to force me off the road. Panic surged through me as I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put some distance between us, but the road stretched on, with no exits in sight. I knew I had to think fast. I didn't, I'd end up in a ditch, or worse. I scanned the highway for any sign of help, but there was nothing. Just miles of empty road and the aggressive car behind me. The fear was growing, gripping my chest like a vice. The car swerved again, this time nudging my rear bumper harder. My tires skidded slightly, and I fought to keep control. I spotted a turnoff up ahead, a narrow road that veered off the highway. Without thinking, I took it, hoping to lose them. My tires screeched as I made the sharp turn, the car behind me hesitating for a moment before following. I had to keep going. The road was rough, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped along, but the car stayed right on me, relentless. Suddenly, the road narrowed, and I saw it, a small, deserted rest stop just off to the side. I slammed on the brakes, skidding into the parking lot and cutting the engine. I ducked down in my seat, heart pounding, praying they wouldn't see me. Car sped past, its headlights fading into the distance. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. What if they came back? I sat there in the darkness, the eerie silence of the night closing in around me. My breath was shallow, my heart still racing. I waited, listening for any sound of the car returning. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. Finally, I let myself breathe. They were gone, for now. I stayed parked at that rest stop until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were long gone. When I finally got back on the road, the fear still clung to me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again. I'll never forget that night. What started as a peaceful drive turned into a nightmare. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just angry, they were dangerous. And the worst part? I never saw their face. I don't know who they were or why they targeted me. But I do know this. Road rage can be deadly. Sometimes, the scariest things on the road aren't the potholes or the weather. It's the people behind the wheel. We were on a family vacation, just cruising through the winding roads of Colorado, admiring the mountain views. The kids were in the back, laying on their tablets, and I was at the wheel, enjoying the peaceful drive. We'd been driving through tunnels all day, kind that cut through the mountains and give you a break from the winding roads. But this one felt different. It was longer, darker, and the air inside felt thick, almost eerie. I didn't think much of it at first. Tunnels are supposed to feel a little unsettling, right? About halfway through, we heard a loud crash. It echoed through the tunnel, a chilling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I instinctively slowed down, unsure of what had happened. My wife turned to me, eyes wide, but neither of us spoke. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, and there was no way to see what was ahead. Another crash, louder this time. My heart started pounding. Something was wrong. We kept driving, but there was this growing sense of dread. The road felt tighter, the darkness closing in around us. Then, out of nowhere, the car in front of us came to a dead stop. I slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding a collision. "What's going on?" my wife whispered, her voice shaking. I glanced at the other cars, all stopped like they were trapped in place. Something about the stillness felt haunting, like we were all frozen in time. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air was cold, too cold for a summer day in Colorado. I walked toward the other drivers, hoping someone had answers. But as I got closer, I noticed something chilling. Some of the cars were empty. No people, no signs of anyone having left. It was as if they had just vanished. My pulse quickened, fear settling deep in my gut. I hurried back to the car, trying to stay calm for the kids. "We need to turn around," I said to my wife, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. The exit behind us was blocked. Huge rocks had fallen, sealing us in. My wife grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We're trapped." The weight of that word hung in the air, making the tunnel feel even more suffocating. I tried to stay calm, but panic was clawing at the edges of my mind. We weren't the only ones trapped. There were other families, other drivers, but no one knew what to do. Some people honked their horns, others shouted into the darkness. The tunnel absorbed the sound, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. And that's when we realized something even more terrifying. The other end of the tunnel had been blocked too. We were completely sealed in. The minutes felt like hours as we waited, hoping for rescue. But with every passing second, the situation felt more hopeless. The air in the tunnel grew colder, and there was a haunting stillness that made the whole place feel like a tomb. My wife and I exchanged nervous glances, but we tried to keep the kids distracted. They didn't need to know how scared we really were. As the hours passed, the tension grew unbearable. We tried the radio. There was nothing but static. Cell phones? No signal. It was as if the entire tunnel was cut off from the world. I stepped out again, hoping to see something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the tunnel stretched on in both directions, an endless, eerie void. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. Abandoned cars, scattered along the sides, their doors wide open. But still, no people. My heart raced as I walked back to our car, the reality sinking in. The other drivers weren't just gone. They had vanished. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Were we next? What was happening to the people in the tunnel? And why hadn't anyone come for us yet? The tunnel, once a simple passage through the mountains, had become a haunting prison, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Hours later, just when it felt like all hope was lost, we heard the sound of engines. Rescue vehicles appeared, their lights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over us as the workers cleared the debris, opening the tunnel once more. But even as we drove out into the light, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that we had just escaped something far worse than a rock slide. Something haunting. And to this day, I wonder what really happened to those abandoned cars and the people who vanished without a trace. It was supposed to be a quick drive across Texas. You know, one of those long, endless highways where the heat rises off the asphalt and the desert stretches out forever. I was cruising along, windows down, music playing, not a care in the world. The sky was cloudless and the sun was relentless. It was the kind of heat that feels like it's pressing down on you, making every breath a little harder. That's when it happened. My engine started to sputter. At first, I thought it was just a hiccup, maybe a little overheating from the scorching sun. But within minutes, the engine gave up completely. My car coasted to a stop, the temperature gauge spiked, and there I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere with no signal and no shade in sight. The highway was deserted, not a single car in either direction for as far as I could see. It was eerie how alone I suddenly felt. I got out, popped the hood, and was greeted by a wave of heat that made me step back. The engine was smoking, and I knew I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I grabbed my phone, but of course, no service. It was one of those moments where you realize just how vulnerable you are. No help, no water, and the desert sun beating down, turning the inside of the car into an oven. It was chilling to think about how quickly things had gone from peaceful to dangerous. I decided to wait it out, hoping someone would pass by, but as the hours dragged on, the desert heat became unbearable. My water bottle was empty, and the sweat was pouring off me. That's when I saw him, a man walking toward me from down the road. At first I felt relieved. Finally help. But as he got closer, that relief turned into something else, something eerie. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, and there was something unsettling about the way he moved. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face, making it hard to see his eyes. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice low and calm, too calm for the situation. I nodded, explaining the overheating, hoping he'd offer to call for help. Instead, he just smiled, this slow, unsettling smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I can help," he said, "but it'll cost you." Now, I didn't have much cash on me, and something about his tone made me uneasy. I told him I didn't have much, just enough to maybe get a tow. But he shook his head, still smiling. "Oh, it's not money I'm after." That's when my stomach dropped. There was something haunting about the way he said it, something that made me instinctively take a step back. He was close now, too close for comfort, and I realized I was completely alone with this man, in the middle of nowhere. Panic started to creep in, but I tried to keep my cool. I thanked him for the offer and told him I'd just wait for someone else to come by. But he didn't budge. He just stood there, watching me, that eerie smile never leaving his face. The silence between us was thick, and every second felt like an hour. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. Then, without warning, he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not going to make it out here," he said, "not without my help." My heart was pounding now, and I knew I had to do something. I thanked him again, this time with more urgency in my voice, and turned to get back in the car, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But as I reached for the door, he grabbed my arm. "Guard," I said. "It'll cost you," he hissed, smile gone, replaced by a cold, haunting look that made my blood run cold. I yanked my arm away, adrenaline kicking in, and jumped into the car, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to lock the doors, and I could hear him tapping on the window, still trying to convince me to let him in. I didn't care about the heat anymore. I sat there, watching him through the glass, my heart racing. He stayed there for what felt like forever, just staring at me, his hand still on the window. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, turned and walked away, disappearing down the road as quietly as he had come. I waited, terrified he might come back, until the sun started to set. Eventually, a passing car spotted me and stopped. They helped me get a tow, and I got out of there as fast as I could. But I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, or the way he made me feel like I was one wrong move away from something terrible. The desert might seem empty, but there are things out there, people, who you don't want to meet. Next time my engine overheats, I'll think twice before trusting a stranger. It was late, way past the time we should have been on the road. My friend and I had been driving through endless stretches of highway, the kind where you can go miles without seeing another car. The night was still, almost too quiet, with nothing but the hum of the engine to keep us company. We'd been talking about everything and nothing, just trying to stay awake. That's when we saw it. Car pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. At first, we didn't think much of it. People break down all the time, right? But something about it felt off. Car was just sitting there, no one outside, and the road was eerily deserted. Still, we figured we should help. Maybe someone was inside, waiting for assistance. We pulled over, and as soon as we did, I felt this strange sense of dread. We'd just made a mistake. My friend looked at me, his eyes saying the same thing. Something wasn't right. We got out, leaving the engine running, and walked toward the car. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the distant hum of cricket. I knocked on the driver's window. No one answered. "Hello?" I called out, peering into the car. That's when I saw it. No one was inside. The car was completely empty. My stomach tightened. Why would someone leave their car like that in the middle of nowhere? Before I could process what was happening, my friend nudged me. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice low, almost shaky. I turned around, and that's when I saw them. 2 men, stepping out from behind the car, their faces hidden in the shadows. My heart raced as they moved toward us, slow and deliberate. There was something chilling about the way they walked, like they knew we had no way out. "We're good," I said quickly, backing up toward our car. "We were just checking to see if you needed help." One of the men smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he knew something we didn't. "Oh, we need help." "All right," said, his voice low and menacing. My friend and I exchanged a quick glance, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a setup. I felt the panic rise in my chest, and without thinking, I turned and sprinted back to our car. My friend was right behind me. The men started running too, faster than we expected. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door, trying to unlock it. Just as one of them grabbed the back of my shirt, I yanked the door open and jumped inside. My friend barely made it in before I slammed the door shut and hit the gas. The tires screeched as we sped off, the men running after us for a few seconds before disappearing into the darkness. My heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We didn't say a word, both of us too shaken to process what had just happened. The road stretched out in front of us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those men following us. And then, just as I thought we were in the clear, headlights appeared behind us. My stomach dropped. The same car, the one with the hazards, was back, and it was closing in fast. My friend swore under his breath, and I floored it, trying to put as much distance between us and them as possible. But they were relentless, their headlights blinding us as they swerved dangerously close. "Go faster," a friend yelled, his voice tense with fear. I pushed the car to its limits, but the road was narrow, and every turn felt like it could be our last. Car behind us kept gaining, their high beams cutting through the darkness like some kind of eerie warning. I could feel the tension building, the air thick with fear. It was a chase now, and I wasn't sure we'd make it out. Suddenly, the car behind us swerved again, this time harder, trying to force us off the road. My heart raced as I fought to keep control of the wheel. It was like they were playing with us, toying with our fear. But then, out of nowhere, the road opened up. I saw a gas station up ahead, its neon lights flickering like a beacon in the dark. It wasn't much, but it was our only chance. I slammed on the brakes, swerving into the gas station's parking lot. The car behind us hesitated for a moment, then sped off into the night, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My friend and I sat there in stunned silence, nor the eerie quiet of the night wrapping around us like a blanket. We had escaped, but just barely. To this day, I can't shake the haunting memory of that night. What started as a simple act of kindness had nearly cost us everything. Now, whenever I see a car broken down on a deserted road, I think twice. Sometimes, the real danger isn't what you can see. It's what's lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to stop. We were somewhere in the middle of nowhere, driving cross-country late at night. The road was endless, and my partner and I were exhausted, barely keeping our eyes open. When we spotted a rest stop sign, we figured it'd be a good place to stretch our legs and recharge, or getting back on the road. As we pulled in, though, something about the place felt off. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the rest stop building looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The place was eerily quiet, with only one dim light flickering above the entrance. We parked and sat there for a second, neither of us speaking, just taking in the haunting atmosphere. "Should we just keep going?" my partner asked, glancing at me, but we were both too tired, and the next stop was miles away. So we got out, deciding to make it quick. Inside, it was worse. The place was run down, graffiti covering the walls, and the air smelled stale, like it had been trapped there for decades. There were no other travelers, no workers, just us. As we walked through the restroom area, we noticed something strange. Words scrawled on the mirrors in red marker. "Leave now." My heart skipped a beat. It felt like a warning, and suddenly the eerie silence became suffocating. We hurried back to the car, the sense of dread growing with every step. But when we got in, the car wouldn't start. My partner tried turning the key again, but the engine just sputtered, refusing to turn over. My pulse quickened. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice shaky. My partner shook their head, frustration and fear in their eyes. It was like we were trapped in some sort of horror movie, with no way out. That's when we noticed them. Figures, standing in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. At first they were just barely visible, but as our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we realized they were watching us. I couldn't make out their faces. There was something chilling about the way they just stood there, still as statues. The car started, I whispered, panic setting in. My partner kept trying. Car wouldn't budge. I could feel my heart racing, my hands shaking as I glanced around the lot, scanning for anything that could help us. Figures didn't move, but their presence felt oppressive, like they were waiting for the right moment. I tried not to panic, but it was hard to think straight with the weight of their eerie stares pressing down on us. The minutes dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. My partner muttered under their breath, desperately turning the key, trying anything to get the engine going. Figures still hadn't moved, but it felt like they were getting closer, like the darkness itself was pulling them toward us. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back and saw something that made my blood run cold. Figures were gone, vanished. They'd never been there at all. The rest stop, once eerie and haunting, now looked like any other lonely highway stop. But I knew what we'd seen. We didn't say a word as we drove away, the silence between us heavy with fear. The road stretched on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that those figures were still watching us from the shadows, waiting for the next unlucky travelers to stop. My partner kept glancing in the rearview mirror, their knuckles white as they gripped the wheel. Neither of us spoke about what had just happened. When we finally made it to the next town, we pulled into a gas station and parked in the light. We sat there for a few minutes just breathing, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over us. "What do you think that was?" my partner finally asked, breaking the silence. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never stopping at a rest stop like that again. To this day, I don't know who or what was watching us that night. But one thing's clear. That rest stop wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. Sometimes the scariest places aren't the ones filled with noise and chaos. They're the ones that sit quietly, waiting, hiding their secret until the right moment. If you ever find yourself at a lonely rest stop in the middle of the night, don't stay too long. You never know who or what might be watching. I've been a trucker for years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day in the Midwest. It was a routine delivery, heading through a remote area, one of those places where the nearest gas station is miles away. I was running low on fuel, so when I saw a small town up ahead, I felt relieved. But the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The streets were empty. Not just quiet, but completely deserted. No cars, no people, no movement at all. The place looked like it had been frozen in time. My truck rolled to a stop at the town's gas station, and I stepped out, calling out a greeting to anyone who might be around. Nothing. Not a single sound except for the eerie creak of an old flagpole swaying in the wind. The silence was haunting. I walked into the gas station, half expecting someone to pop up from behind the counter. But the place was as empty as the street outside. Newspapers lay scattered on the floor, and the clock on the wall had stopped, the hands frozen at 2:15. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone, hoping for some signal, but there was nothing. It was like the whole town had vanished off the map. I stepped back outside, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I walked up and down the street, calling out again, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone here?" But the only response was the eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Cars were parked along the curb, doors left open like their owners had left in a hurry. It was chilling, like something had driven everyone away in an instant. I made my way back to the truck, my mind racing. Something was deeply wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I just wanted to refuel and get out as fast as I could. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. My truck wouldn't start. A cold wave of panic washed over me. I tried again, but the same thing happened. I was stranded. I got out and checked the engine, hoping it was something simple, but everything seemed fine. No visible problems. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, movement. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I saw it again. Shadow moving between the buildings. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. I called out again, but there was no answer. Just that same eerie silence. I stood there, frozen, watching the shadows shift and move, just out of sight. Whoever, or whatever, was there didn't want to be seen. I backed away slowly, feeling the weight of every step as I moved toward my truck. My pulse was racing, and the air felt colder, heavier. The sun was starting to set, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck in this town after dark. I got back in the truck, locking the doors, and sat there trying to figure out what to do. The gas gauge was low, but I couldn't stay here. Not with the eerie silence and whatever was lurking in the shadows. My only option was to wait, hope the truck started again. But as the minutes ticked by, the shadows outside grew longer, and the air inside the cab felt suffocating. Suddenly, I saw movement again. This time, it was closer. A figure, standing just at the edge of the gas station, watching me. My heart nearly stopped. They didn't move, just stood there, staring. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were watching me, waiting. It was haunting, the way they blended into the growing darkness, like they were part of it. I turned the key again, and to my relief, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait to see what the figure would do next. I floored it, speeding out of that silent town as fast as I could. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw more figures stepping out from the shadows, watching me leave. They had been there the whole time, hidden, waiting for something. Or someone. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my heart still pounding in my chest. To this day, I don't know what happened in that town, or why it was abandoned. But I do know one thing. There was something haunting about that place. Something that wasn't ready to let go of the people who had lived there. And I was lucky to get out before I became part of it. Driving through the Rocky Mountains always feels like a thrill. Those sharp turns, the breathtaking views, the endless drop-offs. I had done it many times before, but this trip felt different. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the road. The highway was mostly empty, and I was enjoying the peaceful drive, my car hugging the curves of the narrow mountain road. That's when I noticed it. Far in the distance, coming up behind me fast. A semi-truck, barreling down the highway, swerving like it was out of control. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the driver was just trying to make up time. But as it got closer, I realized something was seriously wrong. The truck wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was speeding up. The sound of the engine roared through the mountains, echoing off the rocky cliffs. My stomach dropped as the massive truck came into view. It was swerving dangerously, weaving across both lanes like the driver had lost control. Or worse, wasn't even conscious. My heart started pounding as the truck bore down on me. I tried to speed up, but the narrow road and sharp turns made it impossible to go too fast. The truck was gaining on me, its headlights flashing wildly as it came closer and closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt a wave of panic. There was no way it was going to stop. It was coming right for me, a massive metal beast that seemed unstoppable. I gripped the steering wheel tight, trying to stay calm. I honked my horn, hoping the truck driver would snap out of whatever daze he was in. There was no response. The truck kept coming, and I could see it swerving dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. If it didn't stop soon, it would either crash into me or go flying off the mountain. Either way, I was trapped in a nightmare. There wasn't much room to maneuver, but I had to do something. I swerved into the opposite lane, praying there wouldn't be any oncoming traffic. The truck roared past me, its trailer swinging dangerously as it hugged the curves of the road. My heart raced as I watched it speed ahead, still out of control. The driver was either asleep at the wheel or worse. I couldn't just let it crash. It would be catastrophic on this narrow road. I sped up, keeping the truck in sight, and tried to think. There had to be a way to signal for help. I frantically searched for a rest area, a pull-off, anything where I could get out of the way or warn someone. There was nothing, just miles of winding mountain highway and the chilling realization that the runaway semi was a disaster waiting to happen. Up ahead, I saw it, another sharp curve in the road, this one leading to a steep downhill stretch. The truck didn't slow down, it would lose control completely, and there would be no coming back. My pulse quickened as I approached the curve, my mind racing for a solution. That's when I spotted it, a runaway truck ramp, just beyond the curve. It was a narrow, gravel-filled escape route designed for emergencies like this, but would the driver notice it in time? I honked my horn again, flashing my headlights wildly, trying to get the truck driver's attention. The semi kept going, speeding down the hill with no sign of slowing. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was it. Truck was headed straight for disaster, and I was helpless to stop it. I watched, breathless, as the massive vehicle hurtled toward the ramp. At the last possible second, the truck swerved. Whether by some miracle or sheer luck, I'll never know. It hit the ramp hard, gravel spraying in all directions as the truck fought to stop. The engine roared one last time, and then finally, it came to a grinding halt. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to process what had just happened. The truck was still, its massive form towering over the runaway ramp, but the danger had passed. I could see the driver through the windshield, slumped over the wheel, unconscious. It was a miracle he hadn't gone off the cliff or taken anyone else with him. I called for help, and soon enough, emergency vehicles arrived to take care of the situation. The truck driver was alive, though barely conscious, and the authorities said he'd likely passed out behind the wheel from exhaustion. It was a chilling reminder of just how fragile life can be, especially on roads like these. Driving through the Rockies always felt like an adventure. But after that day, it felt different. Every sharp turn, every narrow lane, everything seemed more dangerous, more real. That runaway semi could have ended my life, or the lives of anyone else on that road. I was lucky to have escaped, but the memory of those headlights bearing down on me still haunts my dreams. You never know what might be coming up behind you on those quiet mountain roads. I'd driven down that stretch of interstate countless times before, one of those long, lonely highways that seems to go on forever. It was a quiet afternoon, just me and the open road, no traffic in sight. I was thinking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the peaceful drive. That's when I heard it, a loud crack, like a gunshot, followed by the shattering of glass. My windshield exploded in front of me, sending shards flying everywhere. For a split second, I didn't understand what had happened. I swerved, trying to regain control of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. When I pulled over to the side of the road, I realized the horrifying truth. Someone had shot at my car. The thought sent a chilling wave of fear through me. I was being targeted, but by who? And why? I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. There was no one around, no other cars, nothing but the eerie quiet of the empty highway. I scanned the landscape, looking for any sign of movement, but the vast stretch of desert seemed to swallow everything. Whoever had fired that shot was hidden, watching from a distance. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay put or try to drive away? My windshield was shattered, the glass crunching under my hands as I tried to steady myself. Another crack echoed through the air, this one hitting the back of my car. My pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they were still out there, still aiming. I needed to get out of there, fast. I floored it, speeding down the highway, the wind whipping through the broken windshield. My heart raced as I scanned the road ahead, desperate to find an exit, a place to pull off, anywhere safe. But the shots kept coming, each one hitting closer, like the shooter was toying with me, playing a deadly game. It was terrifying, knowing that I was being hunted. The highway stretched on, no exits in sight, no cars, no help. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the sniper wasn't just shooting from one spot. No, it felt like they were following me, always staying just out of sight. Each crack of gunfire sent a wave of panic through me, the sound of the bullets haunting in the vast, empty silence of the road. I tried to think rationally, but fear clouded my thoughts. What kind of person would do this? Was it random, or was I being targeted for a reason? My hands gripped the wheel tight, sweat pouring down my face as I pushed the car faster, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing me. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted it. A small rest stop up ahead, barely visible in the heat haze. I had no choice. I pulled in, skidding to a stop behind the small building, hoping it would shield me from any more shots. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, breathless, waiting for the next crack of gunfire. But this time, there was only silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on high alert, expecting another shot at any moment. But nothing came. The eerie quiet of the rest stop only made things worse. It felt like the sniper was out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't stay there forever, but I didn't dare go back out on the highway. Finally, I gathered the courage to call for help, praying my phone had a signal. To my relief, it did. Police arrived about half an hour later, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness of the desert. They checked my car, the bullet holes in the windshield and rear window, a chilling reminder of how close I'd come to disaster. The officers searched the area, but they found nothing. No trace of the shooter, no sign of where the shots had come from. It was as if the sniper had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but fear and question. I was shaken, but I was alive. Still, the whole experience haunted me. Who had been out there, targeting drivers on a lonely stretch of highway? And why? The police told me I was lucky to have escaped, but the sense of dread didn't leave me. Even now, I can't drive down that stretch of road without looking over my shoulder, wondering if the sniper is still out there, waiting for their next victim. It's a haunting thought, knowing that on these empty highways, you're never really alone. Sometimes danger comes from the places you least expect. It was supposed to be a simple family trip. Just us, the kids, and the open road. My wife was driving the car, towing our camper, and I was in the lead vehicle, keeping an eye on the GPS as we navigated through the remote wilderness. The drive had been peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel disconnected from the world, in a good way. We were far from any towns, surrounded by nothing but dense forest and winding roads. Then, out of nowhere, our radios cut out. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd lost signal a few times already, and it always came back after a few minutes. But this time, something felt off. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see my wife and the kids following close behind. But there was nothing, just the empty road. My heart skipped a beat. Where had they gone? I pulled over to the side of the road, waiting, thinking they'd catch up any second. But minutes passed, and still no sign of them. Panic started to creep in. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. The eerie quiet of the wilderness pressed in on me, the wind rustling through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to find them. I turned the car around and drove back the way I'd come, my eyes scanning every curve, every patch of forest, for any sign of my family. The road stretched on, twisting and turning through the dense trees, but there was no sign of their car or the camper. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. My heart pounded as I drove faster, the fear growing with every mile. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the last spot where I knew I'd seen them. There was nothing. No car, no tracks, just the haunting emptiness of the road and the thick forest surrounding it. I pulled over and got out, calling out their names, my voice echoing in the silence, but the only response was the eerie rustling of the trees. It felt like the woods were swallowing my words. I walked up and down the road, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Had they taken a wrong turn? Was there an accident? But I would have seen something. Skid marks, debris, anything. There was nothing. It was as if they'd been erased from the road, leaving no trace behind. The fear gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of them. The sun was starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows over the road. The wilderness, once peaceful, now felt haunting, like it was hiding something from me. I was desperate, my mind spiraling into dark places. What if they were lost out there? What if someone or something had taken them? Just when I thought I couldn't take the silence any longer, I saw it, faint tracks leading off the road and into the forest. My heart raced as I followed them, my mind screaming that this was my only lead. Tracks were fresh, but they didn't make sense. They led deeper into the woods, far from the road, where no car or camper could possibly go. Still, I followed, my hands trembling, fear clawing at my chest. As I ventured further into the woods, the tracks disappeared, swallowed by the thick underbrush. I stood there, the trees looming over me, casting eerie shadows in the fading light. I called out again, my voice shaking. The forest swallowed my words. It felt like I was walking into a nightmare, kind where nothing makes sense and you're constantly on the edge of something terrible. I searched until the sun had completely set, but there was no sign of my wife or the kids. Exhausted and terrified, I made my way back to the road, my mind racing with every possible explanation. Had they been taken by someone? Had they somehow driven off the road without me noticing? None of it made sense, and the not knowing was the worst part. I finally made it back to my car, cold night air chilling me to the bone. I sat there, staring at the empty road, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The police eventually came, but they found nothing. No car, no camper, no sign that they had ever been there at all. It was like they had disappeared from existence, leaving me with nothing but haunting questions and no answers. To this day, I still search for them. Every lead, every faint rumor, I follow. But deep down, I know the truth. They're gone. And whatever took them that day, whatever made them vanish from that lonely road, it's still out there, waiting, watching. The wilderness isn't always what it seems, and sometimes the things you lose are never meant to be found. It was supposed to be an easy drive home. Late at night, with hardly any traffic, I figured I'd be home in a couple of hours tops. The highway stretched out in front of me, dark and quiet, with only the occasional glow of streetlights to break the monotony. That's when I saw the signs. Bright orange construction warnings, directing me to take a detour. I groaned, but I didn't think much of it. Detours happen all the time, especially on these back roads. I followed the signs onto a narrow, unmarked road that wound through the woods. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. The trees pressed in on both sides, and the road was barely wide enough for one car. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty road ahead. After a while, it started to feel eerie, like I was the only person for miles. But I kept going, trusting the signs. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a set of flashing lights up ahead. Construction vehicles blocking the road. Relief washed over me, thinking I was almost through the detour. I slowed down, expecting to be waved through, but something felt off. There were no workers in sight, just the trucks, sitting there, engines idling, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. I pulled up, rolled down my window, and waited for someone to approach, but no one did. My heart started to race. I honked the horn, hoping to get someone's attention. That's when I saw them. Figures, stepping out from behind the construction vehicles. They weren't wearing hard hats or reflective vests. They didn't look like workers at all. My stomach dropped. Something was very wrong. One of them walked up to my window, a smirk on his face. "You lost?" he asked, his voice low and calm, too calm for the situation. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just following the detour," I said, glancing at the other men who were now surrounding my car. The man smiled, but there was something chilling about it. "Yeah, this road's closed," he said, "but we can help you out, for a price." My pulse quickened. This wasn't construction. This was an ambush. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. There were at least 5 of them, blocking the road in front of me, and more standing behind the car. I was trapped. The man leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "Hand over your wallet, your phone, and whatever else you've got, and we'll let you go," he said. "If not, well, it's a long night." Fear gripped me as I realized how vulnerable I was. The eerie quiet of the forest pressed in, and the air felt thick with tension. I had no signal, no way to call for help, and no way out. My hands trembled as I reached for my wallet, trying to stall for time. But even as I handed it over, I knew it wouldn't be enough. These men weren't just after money, they were after control. I had to think fast. The road was too narrow to turn around, and if I tried to run, they'd catch me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A narrow path leading off the road, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed up as fast as I could. The men shouted, chasing after me, but I didn't stop. It swerved onto the narrow path, the car bouncing over the rough terrain, branches scraping against the windows. My heart pounded as I sped through the trees, my hands gripping the wheel tight. The men were still behind me, their shouts echoing through the woods, but the path was too tight for them to follow in their trucks. I just had to keep going, put as much distance between us as possible. The path twisted and turned, and I had no idea where it would lead, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trees opened up, and I found myself back on the main highway. My heart was still racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of the nearest town in the distance. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking as I tried to catch my breath. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Those men had set up the perfect trap, and I'd nearly fallen for it. I didn't know if they'd catch someone else that night, but one thing was clear. Next time I see a detour sign, I'll think twice. Sometimes the real danger isn't the road ahead. It's the people waiting in the shadows, ready to take advantage of anyone who crosses their path. I'd been on the road for hours, driving through endless stretches of rural highway. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the landscape. I was tired, but I figured I could make it a few more hours before stopping. That's when I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the road, waving her arms frantically. Her car was parked a little ways back, the hood propped open. My first instinct was to keep driving, but something about the look on her face stopped me. Pulled over, rolling down my window. She ran up to the car, face flushed, and asked if I could give her a ride to the nearest town. She explained that her car had broken down and she didn't have cell service. I hesitated for a second, that little voice in the back of my head warning me to be careful, but her desperation seemed real. So I agreed, unlocking the passenger door. As she got in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She was jittery, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her seatbelt. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaky. "I've been stuck out here for hours." I nodded, trying to make small talk, but the conversation quickly turned strange. She started rambling about her car, about how it had broken down before, but her story didn't quite add up. The details kept changing. First, it was a flat tire, Then the engine overheated. A chill crept down my spine as I listened, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. Something wasn't right. I glanced over at her, and that's when I noticed her eyes darting toward my phone on the console. She seemed too interested in it, and I suddenly realized I hadn't seen any car back on the road. My mind started racing. Who was she really? I tried to stay calm, asking her casual questions to see if I could catch her in another lie. But she was quick, changing the subject every time I got close to something that didn't make sense. The tension in the car was growing thick, and the once quiet highway now felt eerie, like we were the only two people left in the world. Every instinct was telling me to get her out of the car. But how? As we continued driving, the sun had set completely, leaving us in darkness. I told her we'd be in town soon, hoping that the thought of other people would keep her calm. But her demeanor shifted. She started asking me about where I lived, how often I drove this route. Questions felt invasive, probing. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just some stranded motorist. This was something else. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Typical for these back roads, but the realization that I was truly cut off from help made my stomach tighten. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her reach into her bag, pulling out something small and shiny. My heart skipped a beat. It was a knife. Panic surged through me, but I didn't let it show. I needed to think fast. I slowed the car down, pretending to look for a turnoff. "Hey, I think we're almost there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a gas station up ahead where we can stop." She didn't respond, just kept holding the knife, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The air in the car felt thick with tension, each second dragging on, the silence becoming unbearable. Finally, I spotted a gas station, its lights flickering in the distance. I pulled into the lot, my heart racing, and parked the car right in front of the entrance, where the clerk inside could see us. "I'll just run in and grab a map," I said, trying to sound casual. She stared at me, her grip tightening on the knife. "I'll come with you," she said, voice low, almost chilling. I nodded, but as soon as I stepped out of the car, I bolted into the gas station, shouting for help. The clerk saw the panic on my face and immediately locked the door behind me. We watched as the woman stood there for a moment, then calmly got out of the car and disappeared into the darkness. No sign of her broken-down vehicle. No sign of her at all. The police came, but they couldn't find her. There was no trace of the woman, no car left on the side of the road where I'd supposedly picked her up. She had vanished, leaving behind only the eerie memory of that haunting ride. I never found out who she was or what her true intentions had been, but one thing was clear. She wasn't who she claimed to be. Since that night, I've been a lot more cautious about picking up hitchhikers. Sometimes, the people who seem most in need of help aren't the ones who are in danger. They're the ones bringing danger to you. If you ever find yourself on a dark road and someone flags you down, think twice. You might be letting more than just a stranger into your car. It was just another evening in the Nevada desert when Jake decided to take a detour down an isolated road, drawn by the promise of adventure. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. He felt a strange chill as he drove, kind that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Suddenly, an eerie, abandoned car came into view, its interior empty and the doors ajar. A shiver ran down his spine, but he decided to investigate. As Jake approached the abandoned vehicle, the silence was almost deafening. The desert had a haunting stillness to it, broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him from the distance. The air seemed to thicken with an unsettling presence, making him feel as if he was being watched. The loneliness of the desert suddenly felt more like a trap. He peered into the car, noting the dust-covered seats and the inexplicably warm engine. It was then he heard it, faint rustling from the desert brush. Jake's heart raced as he scanned the surroundings, but all he could see were the shadows of the creeping night. The sensation of being hunted was palpable, like an invisible predator was closing in on him. Tried to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. The car's engine started on its own. The sound was chilling, reverberating through the emptiness like a sinister whisper. Jake felt a surge of panic. It was as if the car was alive, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He fumbled for his phone to call for help. The signal was dead. The invisible force seemed to be cutting him off from the world. His mind raced as he got back into his car, trying to ignore the oppressive feeling. Every road seemed to look the same under the darkening sky. Familiar landmarks nowhere to be seen. The road he had once found adventurous now felt like a haunted labyrinth. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, and every noise seemed amplified in the dead quiet of the desert night. Jake began to realize that the more he drove, the more the landscape seemed to change. What was once a clear road now twisted and turned in a disorienting manner, as though the desert itself was conspiring against him. The sensation of being pursued grew more intense, and the once serene environment now felt menacingly hostile. The shadows seemed to follow him, growing longer and darker with each passing moment. His attempts to escape the haunting presence were in vain. The road stretched out endlessly, devoid of any recognizable features. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing, heavy and ragged. Every turn seemed to lead him back to the same place, a never-ending cycle of dread and confusion. The invisible force seemed to be toying with him, ensuring he could never leave. As the night deepened, Jake's fear turned into desperation. The road that had once seemed so innocuous was now a nightmarish trap. The engine of the abandoned car continued to roar in the distance, a constant reminder of the unseen threat lurking just beyond his vision. The landscape seemed to close in on him, the horizon merging with the dark sky in an oppressive embrace. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Jake felt as if he was trapped in a haunting, otherworldly loop, his attempts to escape only bringing him closer to the source of his terror. The feeling of being hunted was now an overwhelming certainty, and the road, once a path to adventure, had become a chilling prison from which he could not escape. Finally, in a moment of overwhelming dread, Jake's car came to a sudden halt. The engine sputtered and died, and the oppressive silence of the desert enveloped him completely. He sat there, paralyzed with fear, the haunting realization dawning on him that he might never leave this cursed road alive. The chilling, invisible force had won, and Jake was left alone with his terror, destined to become another ghost story of the Nevada desert.